Ethan opened his eyes and saw a ceiling made of dark beams. It smelled of smoke and something sour. The hands were small. Someone else's. A child's. He brought them up to his face and stared for a long time at the slender fingers with bitten nails. These weren't his hands. He knew that for sure. But he couldn't remember what his hands had looked like before. Just one thing. The last thing. A white light. And a voice with no source that said one word. I'm sorry. Nothing else. The woman by the hearth was darning a sock and didn't look at him. She was thin and stooped and moved the way people move who've been tired not just today, but for a long time. Ethan sat down on the straw mat. The woman turned around. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She said that he'd finally woken up and that Radka, that he'd been asleep. She said he'd been lying there for 3 days. She said she'd been afraid. Ethan looked at her and didn't recognize her. But his body did. His body reached out to her of its own accord. And he realized that this woman was his mother, not his. The boy in whom he'd awakened. He opened his mouth and wanted to say something. He didn't know exactly what. A hoarse sound came out of his throat. The woman stood up and brought him water in a clay cup. He drank and looked out the window. Outside the window was not his city. Wooden signs, a street of packed earth, people in clothes he couldn't recognize. And above it all, a glass grid hung in the sky. Translucent. Enormous. From horizon to horizon. It glowed with a faint blue light and pulsed slowly. Ethan stared at it, unable to understand what it was. Then he blinked. And right before his eyes, a line flashed. Translucent. Hanging in the air. Status. Name. Ethan Park. Age. 8 years old. Grade. Undefined. Rank. None. Level. 0. He read it 3 times. Then he closed his eyes. Then he opened them. The line hadn't disappeared. He thought one thing. This isn't a dream. He thought a second thing. I'm 8 years old. He thought a third thing. I don't know where I am. He thought a fourth thought. But I know who I am. And a fifth. I know what I was capable of. He set the cup down on the floor. He looked at his mother. She was looking at him with an expression he read instantly. Anxiety, relief, exhaustion. He told her he wanted something to eat. She smiled for the first time in 3 days and went to the hearth. Ethan remained sitting on the mat, staring at his little hands. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know why. He didn't know whose voice had told him, I'm sorry. But one thing he knew for sure. He was alive. And he had time. 4 years. He didn't know where that number came from, but it was stuck in his mind like a nail. 4 years until something important. He didn't know what yet, but he was going to find out. His mother brought him a bowl of porridge. He ate slowly. The porridge was bland and watery, but it was the first meal in this body, and he remembered its taste forever. After eating, he stood up. His legs were weak. He took 3 steps toward the window and braced himself with his hands on the windowsill. The street was bustling with life. Boys were running somewhere, shouting. Merchants was pushing a cart loaded with clay pots. A woman carried a basket of laundry balanced on her head, and above each of their heads hung a small, translucent line. Name. Level. Rank. Ethan looked at this and felt something click inside him. Not fear. Not surprise. Something else. Recognition. Not of this world, but of the principle. He saw the system. He could see any system right away. It was the only thing he knew how to do in his past life, which he barely remembered. To see how things were arranged. To see what was superfluous. To see what was missing. He stood by the window, looking at the city with a panel in the sky, and thought, all right, so there's a system here too. So there are rules here too. So I can figure this out too. His mother, standing behind him, told him he needed to go to bed. He nodded. He lay down. He closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He lay there and listened to the city, and he thought, 4 years is a long time. 4 years is enough. First, figure out where I am. Second, figure out what the panel is. Third, figure out why I'm here. He started with the first one. The next morning, he went out onto the street. His mother didn't want to let him go, but he said he needed some fresh air. She let him go. He walked to the end of the street, then to the next one, then to the square. The city was called Kenmo. He learned this from a boy who asked him where he was going. Ethan asked in return what that grid in the sky was. The boy looked at him as if he were crazy and said that it was the sky panel and that it had been there for 16 years. Ethan nodded and kept walking. 16 years. So this world hadn't always been like this. So the panel had appeared. So someone must have put it there. He reached the market square and sat down on his stone step by the fountain. People moved around him. He looked at the lines of text above their heads. Names, levels, ranks. Most were unranked, ordinary people. But sometimes someone would pass by with an inscription that glowed brighter. Bronze, silver. Once a man in heavy armor walked by and a golden light shone above his head. People parted before him. Ethan watched and memorized everything. He sat on the step for 2 hours, then 3. His mother found him around dinner time and took him home. He didn't resist, but the next day he came back, and the next. And every day he learned a little more, what the gates were, where the monsters came from, why players were more important than everyone else, what the first card ceremony, and that in 4 years it would be his turn. Within a month he knew the basics. The panel assigned each person a status, a level, an inventory, but true power came only through the ceremony. At age 12, a child would draw one of 6 cards: swordsman, mage, archer, healer, assassin, summoner. The card determined one's class for life. After that, one could enter the gates, slay monsters, earn rewards, rise in rank. Ethan listened to the stories in the square and organized them in his head like merchandise on a shelf, every fact in its place, every rule in its own compartment. 2 months later, he knew more than most adults in Kenmo. Not because he was smarter, because he listened, because he asked questions, because he took notes. He found an old notebook in the attic and began keeping records. Not in the language of this world, in a language that only his former consciousness remembered. Columns, rows, matrices. His mother saw his notes once and asked what they were. He said he was drawing. She nodded and didn't ask any more questions. 6 months later, Ethan understood the crux of the matter. The system was unbalanced. Players complained about a shortage of skill slots. Yet every day, hundreds of them deleted skills they considered weak. They erased from the panel and forgot about them. Ethan saw this in the square every day. A player would approach the skill shop, open his panel, discard 3, 5, or 10 weak skills, buy one strong one, walk away. The discarded skills would flare up like fine pollen and dissolve into the air. Everyone thought they were gone. Ethan thought so too, for a while. A year later, he already knew the entire economy of the province. He knew which guilds operated in Kenmo. He knew their rates. He knew their problems. He knew that the Silver Fang Guild was the largest in the area and that it had a chronic shortage of high-ranked players. He knew that breakthroughs happened once a month. He knew that after every breakthrough, the city took a week to recover. He knew that his mother worked as a seamstress and earns a pittance. He knew they barely had enough to eat. And he knew that in 3 years he'd have to attend the ceremony. 3 years, then 2, then 1. He was preparing, not for the ceremony, for what would come after. He didn't know what he'd end up with, but he knew one thing. Whatever came his way, he would find a way to use it, because there's no such thing as a useless thing. There are only people who don't know how to use them. That was the only truth he had brought with him from his past life. The last month before the ceremony, his mother barely slept. She was saving money for the trip to the provincial capital, where the temple of the first card stood. Ethan watched her count the coins on the table every evening. He saw her turn down dinner and say she wasn't hungry. He didn't argue. He knew that arguing would only hurt her more. He simply got up before her every morning and cleaned the house. He carried water. He fixed whatever he could. He did everything in silence. She would look at him sometimes for a long time, strangely, as if she didn't recognize him, as if she saw something in him that shouldn't be in a 12-year-old boy, but she didn't ask. After 4 years in this body, Ethan had learned one thing: to be silent in a way that didn't frighten anyone. The morning of the ceremony, they got up before dawn. His mother put a clean shirt on him, the only clean one. She put on her best dress, which wasn't really the best, just the one with the fewest patches. They got into a wagon with other families from Kenmo. 12 children, 12 mothers, 3 fathers. The rest of the fathers had either perished in the breaches or left to seek work in other provinces. The wagon traveled for 4 hours along a dusty road. Ethan was silent. His mother held his hand. Her fingers were cold. The temple of the first card stood on a hill in the center of the city. White stone, wide steps, a crowd at the entrance. 180 children from all over the province. Ethan got in line. His mother stood beside him. Her fingers were white against the sleeve of his shirt. She had given up a 3-month supply of rice to pay for the trip here. She was pinning her hopes on the swordsman. Everyone was pinning their hopes on the swordsman. The line moved slowly. Ethan watched the children ahead of him. Each one approached the altar, pulled a card. The panel would light up. The priest would announce the class. The crowd would react. Swordsman, an approving murmur. Mage, a respectful silence. Archer, nods. Healer, sighs of relief from the mothers. Assassin, anxious whispers. Cinever, a different kind of silence. An awkward one. Ethan was counting. Out of 180 children, 4 summoners were drawn. Each time the mother standing next to her child made the same gesture. She pressed her lips together, averted her gaze, held her child a little tighter than necessary. Ethan watched and memorized it all. It was his turn. He climbed the steps to the altar. On the altar lay 6 cards face down. The priest looked down at him and said, "Choose." Ethan looked at the cards, 6 identical rectangles. No difference at all. He chose the 3rd one from the left. Not because he sensed anything, just because it was the 3rd one from the left. Simple. He flipped it over. The panel before his eyes flashed and began to print. Slowly. Cool. Summoner. Starting card rank. 1 star. Creature. Nameless servant. Weapon. None. Stats. All base. His mother made a sound behind him. Not a sob. A quiet exhale. As if the air had been let out of her. On the 3rd day after the ceremony, Ethan took the servant out to the market square. He had a reason. He'd spent the entire previous day watching the square from around the corner of the bakery and counting. How many players passed by in an hour? How many of them stopped at the skill shop? How many opened their panel right on the street? The result? An average of 22 eye per hour. Of those, 4 to 7 remove at least 1 skill before entering the shop. Peak hours, from noon to 3. Ethan jotted all this down in his notebook and drew a diagram of the square, marking exactly where players most often stood when clearing their inventory. On the morning of the 3rd day, he brought a servant to the square and stationed him by the eastern wall of the skill shop. He himself sat down on the curb 3 steps away. He took out a flatbread. He started eating and waiting. Nothing happened for the first hour. The servant stood there silently. Ethan chewed. A bronze-ranked player walked by. He stopped. Opened his panel. Swiped through the list. Deleted something. The panel flickered. The skill vanished. And in that very second, Ethan saw it. Not with his own eyes. Through the servant. As if for a split second, he'd seen through the creature's eyes. And he saw a pollen. Fine. Almost invisible. Glowing with a pale gray light. It hung in the air where the player had been standing. Slowly descending. Melting away. Ethan stopped chewing. He looked at the servant. The servant looked at the pollen. For the first time, his empty eyes expressed something. Not emotion. Attention. The pollen touched his shoulder and was absorbed. It simply seeped in, like water into dry cloth. Ethan's panel was silent. Not a single notification. Not a single line. As if nothing had happened. Ethan slowly placed the flatbread on his knee. He opened the panel. He checked the servant's status. Everything was the same. An unnamed servant. 1 star. Basic stats. Nothing had changed. But he'd seen it. He'd seen the pollen enter the servant. He'd seen it through their connection. He knew something had happened. It was just that the panel hadn't detected it. He sat on the curb and thought. Then he took out his notebook. New entry. Absorption number 1. Source. Unknown bronze rank player. Remote skill. Unknown. Panel's reaction. 0. Servant's reaction. Absorption through the skin. He closed the notebook and continued waiting. By lunchtime, there had been 14 more removals within the square's radius. Of those, the servant absorbed 9. 5 were too far away. Ethan measured the distance, about 100 meters. Beyond that, the pollen dispersed faster than the servant could collect it. He wrote that down too. By evening, the count was 31. 31 units of absorbed pollen in a single day. The panel was silent. Ethan took the servant home. His mother was already asleep. He sat down at the table. He lit a candle. He opened his notebook, and he began to think. What did he have? The servant absorbs deleted skills. The panel doesn't see this. Skills don't disappear when deleted. They turn into pollen. Only the servant sees the pollen. Absorption occurs passively. The radius is about 100 meters. Question 1. What does the servant do with what it absorbs? Question 2. Can this be controlled? Question 3. Is there a limit? He wrote down all 3 questions. He closed the notebook. He went to bed. The next day, he returned to the square. And the next. And the next. For 5 days in a row, he brought the servant to the square and sat on the curb with a flatbread and his notebook. By the end of the 5th day, the servant had absorbed 247 units of pollen. Ethan kept track of each one. Time, place, approximate type. He could identify some by their color. Reddish pollen meant combat skills. Greenish meant healing or restoration. Blue meant passive stats. Gray meant remnants he couldn't classify yet. He drew a table. Columns. Rows. Just like in his past life. Just like in the warehouse. Only instead of boxes of tomatoes, there were other people's discarded skills. On the 5th evening, he sat at the table and looked at the table. And he asked the servant a question. What do you see inside yourself? The servant didn't answer with words. He couldn't speak. But through their connection, Ethan sensed something. Not a thought, a sensation. As if inside the servant lay a pile of tiny details. Scattered, unconnected, waiting. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to see it more clearly, through the connection, through the servant's eyes. And he saw it. Inside the servant was something like an empty room, large and dark. On the floor lay specks of light, 247 of them. Each was slightly different in color and shape. They just lay there. They didn't interact. They didn't fit together. They were waiting. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the table. And suddenly he understood. They don't fit together on their own. They need to be assembled, like a set, like a collection on a shelf. Each piece is useless on its own. But if you pick the right ones and connect them. He grabbed the notebook. He began going through the entries. 247 items. Which ones were compatible? Which ones complemented each other? Which ones belonged to the same category? He worked for 2 hours. 3. The candle burned out. He lit a second one. His mother woke up and asked why he wasn't sleeping. He said he was doing some calculations. She shook her head and lay back down. By midnight, he had found the first match. 31 specs from the blue spectrum, all related to movement, acceleration, balance, coordination. Individually, each contributed a fraction of a percent. Useless, but if he added them up. He found more. 9 greenish specks marked balance, compatible with the blue ones, and 2 fragments that differed from the rest. Not specks, shards, brighter, denser. He flipped through his notebook and found an entry. 2 days ago, 2:20 p.m. A silver-ranked player deleted 2 techniques in a row. The pollen wasn't gray but white with a silvery sheen. Ethan had marked them with his special symbol back then. Now he understood why they were different. These weren't passive skills. They were shards of techniques. Real techniques. Someone had once paid money for them, then decided they were weak, and erased them. Ethan looked at his records. 31 acceleration fragments, 9 balance passives, 2 technique shards. He didn't know what kind of techniques they were, but a name flashed from his mind via the connection with his servant. Step of the Water Dancers. It sounded beautiful. It sounded useless. The silver player had good reason to erase it. But Ethan looked at the table and saw something else. 31 plus 9 plus 2. 42 elements. All from a single cluster. All compatible. Individually, they were junk. Together. He didn't know what they'd be together, but he knew the principle. Goods that don't sell individually are often sold in sets. He looked at the servant. The servant was standing in the corner, watching him. Ethan said one word. Gather. The servant closed his eyes. Ethan sensed through the connection that something had shifted inside the servant. 42 specks of light rose from the floor of the dark room. They drew closer together. They began to spin. Slowly. Then faster. The specks fused together. They lost their shape and merged into a single. Bright. Dense. The strand entered the servant and vanished. A minute later, the servant opened his eyes. Ethan checked the panel. The panel was silent. Not a single notification. Not a single change in the servant's status. As if nothing had happened. Ethan looked at the servant and said, "Take a step." The servant took a step. Ethan blinked. The servant was standing by the window. He had just been in the corner of the room. 3 meters. In a fraction of a second. No sound, no trace. His mother woke up to a noise. Not from the step. From the cup the servant had knocked over with his shoulder. The cup fell to the floor and shattered. His mother sat up on her mattress and looked at the shards. Ethan quickly said he dropped it. She looked at him, at the servant in the corner by the window, at the shards. She lay back down. Ethan stood in the middle of the room and looked at the servant. His heart was beating fast, not out of fear, out of understanding. It works. 42 pieces of junk, discarded, forgotten, useless to anyone. He gathered them into one and obtained a device that isn't in the catalog, a device that the panel cannot see, a technology that exists only inside the servant. He sat down at the table, opened his notebook, a new page, a heading, the result of the first assembly, components, 42. Result, a technology of movement, speed, high, accuracy, requires calibration, visibility to the panel, 0. He closed the notebook. He looked out the window. Outside, it was night. The panel in the sky pulsed blue. Ethan thought, every day, all over the world, players delete thousands of skills, millions of skills. Pollen settles and disappears. Everyone thinks it disappears. It doesn't disappear. It waits. His servant can collect it. The panel doesn't see this. So, he's sitting on an endless warehouse of free raw materials. The warehouse is restocked every day. No one knows the warehouse exists. No one knows there's someone who can take from it. He remembered. In his past life, he spent 12 hours a day optimizing tomato shipments. He counted inventory. He built models. He knew which box on which shelf yielded the highest turnover. Now he has a different warehouse, different goods. But the principle is the same. The next morning, Ethan woke up and checked the servant's panel first thing. Nothing had changed. An unnamed servant. 1 star. Basic stats. Teleportation wasn't listed anywhere. The panel didn't detect it. Ethan smiled. Then he stopped smiling and thought, it's good that it doesn't see it. It's bad that he doesn't understand why. He sat down at the table and opened his notebook. He wrote down 2 questions. First, why doesn't the panel track the servant? Second, is there a limit to the number of absorptions? He found the answer to the first question 3 days later. He experimented. He asked the minion to activate its teleportation ability near other players. Then he checked to see if anything had appeared in the system logs. Nothing. The minion didn't show up in the logs. At all. Ethan dug deeper. He opened the panel's advanced interface. He found a section that most players had never even opened, the creature's system log. For summoners, this log kept track of every action the creature took, every mana consumption, every point of damage taken, every skill used. Ethan's log was empty. Not blank, empty, as if it had never been created. The servant didn't appear in the system. The panel knew he existed. It showed him in the status, but it didn't track him. Like a security camera recording an empty hallway. The camera is working, but to it, the hallway is empty. The servant existed in a blind spot. Ethan wrote this down in his notebook in capital letters. The system's blind spot. He underlined it twice. He found the answer to the second question a week later. There was no limit, or if there was, Ethan didn't see it. Every day, the servant consumed between 30 and 60 units of pollen in the square. The count kept rising. 400, 500, 600. The servant didn't slow down. He didn't overload. He showed no signs of reaching a limit. The dark room inside him simply kept getting bigger. Ethan began to grasp the scale of it all. If he collected over 300 units in a single square of a small provincial town in a week, how much pollen would the capital produce? A major guild? The academy? The training ground? The numbers were enormous, and all these numbers were unclaimed. But Ethan wasn't in a hurry. He remembered a rule from his past life. A greedy buyer fills his warehouse quickly and goes bankrupt because half the goods sit there as dead weight. A smart buyer takes only what can be sold or, in his case, assembled. He began to filter. Not every unit of pollen was suitable for assembly. Some units were too fragmented. Only a trace remained of them, a faint shadow. Using them was like trying to sew a shirt out of dust. Ethan marked these units in gray and crossed them off the worksheet. Of the 600 he'd absorbed, about 120 were junk, even by his standards. He sorted the remaining 480 into categories: movement, defense, attack, recovery, perception, miscellaneous. The largest category was movement. Players most often removed minor passes related to speed and agility because they were the easiest to replace with something better. The second largest category was recovery, basic healing, weak regeneration, remnants of meditative techniques. Warrior players removed them first because they considered them useless in combat. Ethan looked at the table and saw in it what he had once seen in a supermarket warehouse. A pattern, a rhythm, predictability. He could predict what type of pollen would appear tomorrow. He could time it right. He could position himself in the right spot. He no longer sat on the curb by chance. Now he chose his position. In the morning, the servant stood by the store's east wall. Swordsmen often passed by there, removing passive movement skills. After lunch, Ethan moved the servant to the store's west entrance. Mages passed by there, clearing basic healing skills. By evening, they went to the fountain where young players would remove 5 or 10 weak skills at a time after their training sessions. He optimized the collection route just like a delivery route. Point A, point B, point C. Maximum coverage with minimal movement. He spent 2 weeks refining the system. By the end of the second week, the daily collection had increased from 30 to 70 units. Not because there were more players, because Ethan had learned to place the servant in the right place at the right time. In the third week, he decided to conduct a second collection run. The first had provided the technique for movement. Now he needed something else. He looked at the servant and thought. The servant had weak arms, no weapons. If a fight broke out, he could escape thanks to the water dancer's step, but he wouldn't be able to strike. Ethan opened his notebook. He found the attack category, 213 entries. 17 of them were fragments of hand-to-hand combat techniques. 4 of them belonged to his single school. He recognized this by their distinctive silvery hue. One of the sword dreamers had erased 4 techniques from the northern school of hand-to-hand combat. Individually, each was a fragment, half a strike, a quarter of a stance, a shadow of a block. But together, they formed a foundation. A rough one, an incomplete one, but a foundation nonetheless. Ethan added 43 defensive moves for arm strength, 12 defensive moves for strike accuracy, 6 scraps of grappling techniques that someone had erased the day before yesterday. A total of 65 components. He checked their compatibility. He spent an entire evening on it. He drew up a matrix, each element in a row and a column. At the intersection, a mark, compatible, incompatible, partially compatible. Of the 65, 51 were fully compatible. 14 had to be set aside. He told the servant, gather them. 51. The servant closed his eyes. The process took longer than the first time, not a minute, but 3. Ethan could feel through the connection how the particles inside the servant rose, collided, repelled each other, and came together again. Some refused to merge. Ethan guided them, not with his hands, but with his mind, through the connection. He visualized the elements falling into the correct order. Like on a shelf, first the foundation, then the amplifiers, then precision, then grip. Layer by layer. After 3 minutes, the thread had formed, thicker than the first one, darker. It entered the servant, and Ethan sensed how the creature's body had changed, not on the outside, on the inside. The servant's hands became slightly denser. His fingers were slightly stiffer, as if someone had poured substance into empty molds. Ethan said, hit the wall. The servant turned toward the wall. He took a swing and struck. The wall cracked. It didn't collapse. It cracked. The crack ran upward from the point of impact for half a meter. Ethan looked at the crack. He looked at the servant's fist, not a scratch on his knuckles. He quickly ushered the servant away. He went out into the yard. He examined the wall from the outside. The crack wasn't visible from the street. Lucky break. He went back inside and patched the crack with clay from the bucket by the door. His mother didn't see it. She was at work. Ethan sat down at the table. He jotted it down. Result of the second build. Components, 51. Result, basic level hand-to-hand combat technique. Impact force, average. Hand protection, present. Visibility to the panel, 0. Assembly time, 3 minutes. Servant fatigue, negligible. He closed his notebook. Now the servant had 2 techniques. The water dancer's step, the nameless strike. Ethan named the second technique himself. The panel didn't name what it couldn't see, so he would be the one to name it. For the next 2 days, he didn't go to the square. He trained the servant, in the courtyard, at night, while the neighbors slept. The servant moved around the courtyard. Strike, step, strike, step. Ethan stood to the side and corrected him. Not like a coach, like a fine-tuner. Your stride is too wide. Shorten it. The strike comes with a delay after the step. Eliminate the pause. The turn isn't complete. Add hip momentum. He didn't know combat techniques. He knew logistics, and the logistics of the body are the same routes. The same optimization. Minimum movement, maximum result. By the morning of the third day, the servant was moving differently. Not like a fighter, not like a dancer, like a machine. Precise, fast, without any excess. Ethan watched him and for the first time felt something resembling pride. Not for himself, for the product. He remembered how in his past life his boss had once said that a good analyst isn't the one who finds the solution, but the one who builds a system that finds solutions on its own. Ethan hadn't understood it then. Now he did. The servant was his system. He wasn't fighting for him. He was fine-tuning him, assembling him, calibrating him. And the servant did the rest. By the fourth week, Ethan had made a decision. The plaza provided a steady stream, but a limited one. He needed more. He needed access to a place where players constantly deleted skills in large numbers. A guild, a training ground, a skill shop. To do that, he needed a reason to be there. A legitimate reason. A 12-year-old boy couldn't just hang around the guild every day without an explanation. People would notice. They'd start asking questions. He needs a job. He got up in the morning, washed his face, put on a clean shirt, a second clean one. His mother had bought him a new one a week ago with money she'd been saving for 2 months. Ethan looked at his reflection in a bucket of water. A skinny boy, an ordinary face. Nothing remarkable. Fine. He doesn't need to stand out. He left the house and walked toward the Silver Fang Guild building. Not toward the main entrance, toward the back, toward the service entrance. He knew that guilds were always looking for janitorial help, mopping floors, hauling boxes, sorting equipment. For his first week at the guild, Ethan kept quiet and worked. He mopped floors. He hauled crates of equipment from the basement to the second floor. He sorted the scrolls that the instructors tossed into a communal basket after class. He did it quickly and neatly. The quartermaster was pleased. The other janitors didn't notice him. He was just another skinny boy with a bucket. There were 3 like him in the guild. Ethan became the 4th. But he wasn't like the others. The others worked to earn 3 copper coins. Ethan worked to stay inside the building. Every hour spent within the guild's walls earned the servant between 100 and 200 units of pollen. The numbers were incomparable to those in the square. Out in the square, he'd collect 300 in a whole day. Here, he'd get 500 in half a shift. By the end of his first work week, the total had surpassed 2,000. Ethan stopped keeping track of individual units. He switched to categories. The columns in his notebook now looked different. Movement, plus 412 for the week. Defense, plus 189. Attack, plus 341. Recovery, up by 276. Perception, up by 93. Miscellaneous, up by 204. He could see the trends. Monday and Tuesday were the most productive. Players returned after weekend raids and cleared out their inventory before the new week. Wednesday is a slump. Thursday is an upturn. Friday is the peak. Saturday is quiet. Sunday is empty. He drew up a schedule and began adjusting the servant's route inside the building to coincide with peak hours. In the morning, the servant stood by the training hall on the first floor. There, instructors were leading warm-ups and cadets were shedding unnecessary starting skills. After lunch, the servant moved to the reception area on the second floor. There, players were processing scroll returns and clearing their panels at the same time. In the evening, the servant stood by the exit of the skill shop in the right wing. That's where the main flow of deletions took place. Ethan managed the servant not with orders, but by positioning him. He'd place him at the right spot and walk away to mop the floor in the adjacent hallway. The servant stood there and collected. Silently, invisibly. By the second week, Ethan ran into his first problem. That a systemic one, a human one. He was mopping the floor near the reception area at 7:30 in the evening. The guild was already closing. The lights in the hallways were going out. The last players were leaving. Ethan was sitting in a corner behind the counter writing in a notebook. He couldn't help himself. He needed to process the day's data while it was still fresh. He was sketching out a matrix for the third build. This time, he planned to assemble defensive gear for a servant, passives for skin durability, scraps of shield spells, fragments of evasion techniques, all low rank, all discarded. But together, enough for the servant to withstand at least one direct hit from a bronze rank player. He was so engrossed that he didn't hear the footsteps. A voice rang out right above him. "What are you writing?" Ethan looked up. Standing before him was a girl, 14 years old, maybe 15. A long braid over her shoulder, a guild administrator's uniform, a gray jacket with a silver patch, a straight back, meat hands, A thin silver ring on the ring finger of her right hand. Not jewelry, an official marker. Ethan looked at her panel. Sojin, 14 years old, class, registrar, rank, bronze, level, 13. Registrar. He heard of this class. Rare, administrative, not combat-oriented. In a world where everyone wanted to be a swordsman, a registrar was considered something like an accountant. Useful for the guild, useless for everything else. Jin was looking at his notebook. Ethan closed it, slowly, not abruptly. A sudden movement would have drawn more attention. He said he was drawing. Jin didn't believe him. He could tell by the look in her eyes. She wasn't stupid. She was a registrar. Her class literally consisted of observing and recording. She stared at him silently for 5 seconds. Then she turned and walked away. Ethan sat there thinking. She'd seen the notebook. Not what was inside, but she'd seen that he was writing. During his shift. In the restricted area of the guild. Janitors don't write. Janitors mop floors. She knows that. The question is, will she report him or not? He decided to wait. If she ratted him out, he'd leave the guild and find another place, the square of the training ground, anything. The loss would be significant, but not catastrophic. She didn't rat him out. A day passed. Then 2. Then 3. No one came asking questions. The quartermaster didn't summon him. The instructors paid him no mind. Ethan continued working. On the 4th day, Ji-in showed up again. Ethan was mopping the floor in the reception area. She walked past him to her desk. She sat down. She took a thick folder out of a drawer. She placed it on the edge of the desk, the edge closest to Ethan. Then she left without saying a word. Ethan waited a minute. He walked over. He opened the folder. Inside were sheets of paper. Dozens of them. Tables. Charts. Numbers. Internal statistics on skill removals for the Silver Fang Guild over the past 6 months. How many skills have been removed? What type? What rank? On which days? At what times? Broken down by floor. Broken down by player class. Everything. Ethan held the folder and didn't move. He looked at the data and felt his mouth go dry. This was gold. Pure gold. With this data, he could predict the pollen flow not just a day in advance, but a week. A month. He could optimize the servant's route to perfection. He could plan harvests in advance. He closed the folder, put it back. He picked up the bucket. He continued washing. That evening, Ji-in came back for the folder. Ethan was standing by the wall with a rag. She took the folder. She looked at him. He looked at her. Not a word. She left. The next day, the folder was sitting on the edge of the table again. A different one. For a different time period. Ethan read it and memorized it. This went on for a week. A new folder every day. A different set of data every day. Ji-yoon didn't ask why. Ethan didn't explain. They didn't talk. But something had developed between them. Not friendship, not an alliance, an agreement. A silent one. Toward the end of the 2nd week, Ethan lingered in the reception area longer than usual. Everyone had left. Jine sat at her desk working on reports. Ethan was mopping the floor in the far corner. He finished. He set down the bucket. He walked over to her desk. He sat down in the chair across from her. She looked up. He placed his notebook on the table. He opened it to the page with the matrix. Ji-yoon looked at it for a long time. Her eyes moved across the rows and columns. Ethan could see how she was reading. Not the letters, the structure. She could see that it was a compatibility chart. She didn't understand what was being compared, but she could see the structure, because she was a registrar. Her brain was wired for record-keeping and analysis. She looked up at Ethan. He was waiting for a question. She didn't ask one. Instead, she opened her drawer and took out another folder, thicker than the previous ones. She placed it next to the notebook. Ethan opened it. Complete statistics for 3 years. Not 6 months. 3 years. He looked at her. She said one sentence, that she'd always wanted to know where the deleted data went. Ethan closed the folder. He looked at her. And for the first time in a long time in this world, he told the truth. Not all of it, just part of it. He said that what was deleted didn't disappear. Jine didn't blink. She wasn't surprised. As if she'd been waiting for those exact words. She nodded. She stood up. She walked over to the teapot in the corner of the reception area. She returned with 2 cups. She set one down in front of him. They drank tea in silence. It was getting dark outside the window. The guild was empty. Just the 2 of them and a servant standing by the wall. Ethan sipped his tea and thought. He had found his first ally. Not a friend, not a servant, an ally. A person who sees the same things he does. The structure, the patterns, the numbers, and who, like him, has no one to tell about it. The next day, Ethan conducted his third build, a defensive one. 93 components. The servant received a passive shield. Invisible, not flashy. His skin simply became tougher. A blow that would previously have left a bruise now left no mark. The panel was silent. A day later, the fourth assembly. Per section. 67 components. The servant began to see in the dark, not like a cat. Better. The panel remained silent. Ethan kept track. His notebook was bulging. He started a second one. The data was multiplying. Combinations multiplied. Each build taught him something new. Which elements worked best together? Which ones conflicted? Which ones required an intermediary to connect? He wasn't building an arsenal. He was building a methodology, a build system, a framework. In the fourth week at the guild, something happened that he hadn't planned on. He was mopping the floor in the hallway outside the training hall. The door was ajar. A class was in session inside. The instructor was demonstrating the basic swordsman's stance to a group of young players. Ethan wasn't watching. He was listening. The instructor spoke monotonously, repeating the same thing over and over. Left foot back, right shoulder forward, weight on the heel. Ethan listened and automatically compared it to what he knew from the techniques he pieced together. The 4 fragments of the northern school that he fused into a nameless strike contained a different stance. Weight not on the heel, on the ball of the foot. Left leg not back, but slightly to the side. The difference was minimal, but it was there, and it changed everything. Ethan stopped with the rag in his hand. The door was ajar. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a girl in the far corner of the hall. She was standing in the stance the instructor was demonstrating. But she wasn't standing correctly, not according to the instructions. She was standing with her feet wider apart, more roughly, with her weight on her entire foot. The instructor walked over to her and corrected her. She assumed the correct stance. 10 seconds later, she slipped back into her own. The instructor corrected her again. She slipped back again. The instructor said something sharp. She clenched her teeth. Ethan saw this through the crack in the door. And he saw something else. Her stance. The one that was wrong. It was closer to the northern school style than to the standard one. Not exactly, but closer. As if her body knew instinctively where to stand, but her mind wouldn't agree. He memorized her face. Young. 15. Maybe a little older. Short hair, angry eyes, calluses on her wrists from a blade. Not a training blade, a real one. He memorized her and returned to the floor. Later, he asked Ji-yoon who that girl was. Ji-yoon replied, Hannah Lee. 15 years old, silver rank, Windblade class, heiress to the younger branch of the Lee trading house, known for defeating all her peers and half of her seniors in sparring matches, and for cursing in 3 dialects, and for the fact that her cousin from the main branch regularly tells her she hits like a dock worker. Ethan listened and took notes, not in a notebook, in his head. Hannah Lee, rough stance, northern school, cousin from the main branch, hits like a dock worker. He didn't yet know why he needed this information, but he knew that information is never superfluous, only unsorted. In his 6th week working at the guild, Ethan saw the senior instructor for the first time. Min Sojin, 34 years old, gold rank, spearman class of the northern outpost, a veteran of the last breakthrough 5 years ago. Ethan knew this from conversations he'd overheard in the hallways. Everyone knew that So Jiang had lost his entire squad in that battle. Few knew that his hands had been trembling ever since. Ethan noticed it on his very first day. So Jiang was standing by the window on the 2nd floor holding a cup. The cup was shaking. Not much. Barely noticeable. But Ethan was used to noticing the little things. He was mopping the floor 3 meters away from So Jiang and watching his hands. So Jiang felt his gaze. He turned his head. He looked at the assistant with the bucket. Ethan lowered his eyes and continued mopping. So Jiang said nothing. A week passed. Then another. A third. Ethan worked. The servant collected. The notebook grew. By the end of the 2nd month, the guild's total number of absorptions had surpassed 8,000 units. From those, Ethan had compiled 7 fully fledged techniques. The water dancer's step, the nameless strike, the passive shield, and night vision. Quiet breathing. The last one allowed the servant to recover his strength 3 times faster than usual. 2 more were experimental. One didn't work all the way through. The second one worked, but had a side effect. The servant lost the ability to see pollen for 12 hours. Ethan recorded this as a critical incident and stopped experimenting with untested combinations. He learned from his mistakes. Slowly, but he learned. He spent his evenings in the back room. After the guild closed, he locked the door and sat down at the table. The servant stood in the corner. Ethan worked with his notebook. He planned the next blend. He checked compatibility. He drew matrices. Sometimes Jaime would come in and bring tea. Sometimes they sat in silence. Sometimes she asked questions. Not direct ones. Cautious ones. She asked how many types of pollen he could distinguish. He answered, 6 main types, 14 subtypes. She asked how he determined compatibility. He explained, by color spectrum, by density, by dispersion rate. 3 parameters. If at least 2 of the 3 match, the elements can be fused. She listened and nodded. She didn't understand everything, but she understood the structure. That was enough. One evening in the 3rd month, she asked him why he did this. Ethan was silent for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. He said the only thing he knew how to do was assemble, and that if he didn't assemble, he wouldn't know why he was here. Jian looked at him and said she understood, that she'd been keeping records her whole life and didn't know why either. She just kept them. Because if you don't keep records, what's the point of being a registrar? They looked at each other, and for the first time ever, Ethan saw in her not an ally, a person, just like him, embedded in a system he hadn't chosen, doing work that no one appreciates, keeping records that no one reads. He told her one thing, not about a servant, not about the pollen, about her. He said that her class, registrar, wasn't accounting. He said he'd seen her reports and that they showed the movement of skills throughout the guild in real time, that she saw flows that no one else saw, that this wasn't record keeping, it was intelligence. She could tell at any moment who in the guild had grown weaker, who had acquired new skills, who's getting ready to leave, who's buying items atypical for their class. She sees it in the numbers every day and doesn't understand what she's seeing. Ji Yoon listened. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her fingers turn white as she gripped the cup. She didn't answer. She stood up. She took the cup. She left. Ethan was left alone. He knew he'd said too much, or exactly as much as he needed to. The next morning, Ji Yoon arrived at work before anyone else. Ethan watched her sit at her desk and reread her own reports, slowly, as if for the first time. She read them all day. At lunchtime, he saw her open a new folder and begin to some other kind of record. Not the standard one, her own. He didn't ask what kind. She'd tell him when she was ready. A week after that conversation, what Ethan had both been waiting for and dreading happened. Sojeon found him. Not during the day. At night. Ethan was sitting in the back room at 10 o'clock in the evening, working on a matrix for a new build. He was planning to assemble a device he called to himself the Quiet Eye, a combination of 191 fragments of perception skills, passive abilities for hearing, peripheral vision, and the sense of vibration. Individually, each added 0.5% to one of the senses. Together, they could give a servant the perception of an experienced tracker. Ethan was poring over the table and didn't hear the door open. Sojeon stood in the doorway, looking at him. Ethan looked up and froze. Sojeon said nothing. His eyes were on the notebook, on the chart, on the rows and columns, on the compatibility matrix. Ethan didn't close the notebook. It was too late. Sojeon had seen it. They stared at each other for 10 seconds. 20. Ethan waited. Sojeon could have gone to the guild master. He could have asked questions. He could have raised the alarm. A 12-year-old assistant keeping complex tables at night in a locked storeroom. That's not normal. It's suspicious. Sojeon did none of those things. He silently entered the storeroom, closed the door behind him, sat down on a crate across from the table, pulled a small clay teapot from his belt. He set it on the table. He took out 2 cups. He poured the tea. He pushed one toward Ethan. He picked up his own. He took a sip. He set it down. All of this in silence. Ethan looked at the cup, then at Sojeon. Then he picked up the cup and took a sip. The tea was bitter, herbal. Infused with something Ethan couldn't identify. They sat in silence and drank tea. Sojeon didn't ask what was in the notebook. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask who this boy really was. He just drank tea. Ethan understood. Sojeon was a veteran. He'd seen things. He'd seen things that shouldn't exist, and he learned not to ask. Not because he didn't want to know, because he knew that some answers were dangerous. They finished their tea. Sojeon stood up. He picked up the teapot. He walked toward the door. He stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said one sentence. That tomorrow, he'd bring the old technical assessment reports from previous years. Ethan nodded even though Sojin couldn't see him. Sojin left. Ethan sat alone in the back room. A cup with the last of the tea sat on the table. He looked at it and thought. 2 allies. Jin. Sogin. One provides data. The other provides protection. Neither knows everything, but both know enough. And both remain silent. He jotted it down in his notebook. A circle. 2 out of 4. 2 more are needed. Someone with medical knowledge. Someone his age. The next day, Sojin came again, with a teapot and a folder. The folder was thick. Old reports spanning 10 years. Technician evaluations, skill classifications, test results, system data that wasn't publicly available. Ethan read all night. On the 3rd evening, Sogin came again. On the 4th. On the 5th. They didn't speak. They just sat there. Tea. A notebook. Folders. Silence. On the 6th evening, Sojin came without a folder. With a spear. He leaned his spear against the wall and sat down. Ethan looked at the spear. Long. Heavy. The tip slightly dulled. Not from age. From disuse. Ethan looked at Sogin's hands. They lay on the table, trembling. Slightly. Almost imperceptibly. But Ethan saw it. Sojin caught his gaze. He didn't pull his hands away. He didn't hide them. He simply looked back at him. Ethan understood. Sojin didn't just come by to drink tea. He came because, in this back room, someone was doing something he hadn't seen anywhere else. Someone was working with a skill set unlike anyone else's. Someone saw the system differently, and Sojin was hoping. He didn't say anything. He acted, hoping that maybe this boy with a notebook would find something for his hands too. Ethan didn't say anything. Not that evening. It was too early. He didn't yet know how to put together what Sojin needed, but he wrote it down in his notebook. Task. Compensate for tremors under high mana load. Type. Stabilization passive. Components. Unknown. Status. In development. He looked at Sojin. Sojin was drinking tea. His hands were shaking. The cup was trembling. Ethan looked away and returned to his notebook. 3 days later, Hannah Lee reappeared in his line of sight. He was mopping the floor at the entrance to the training ground. She walked out the door, red-faced, angry. The calluses on her wrists were fresh and bleeding. A young man in expensive armor followed her out, her cousin from the main branch of the Lee family. He called after her that she was hitting like a dock worker again, that she should drop the blade and go to bag sand, that she didn't meet his silver rank for that. Hannah walked down the hallway without looking back. Her back was straight. Her jaw was clenched. Her eyes were wet not from tears, but from rage. She walked past Ethan. He was standing against the wall with a rag in his hand. She didn't see him. An assistant with a rag is just part of the wall. Ethan watched her go. Then he looked at his cousin. His cousin had walked off in the other direction. Satisfied. Ethan dropped the rag into the bucket and thought. He'd seen her stance. He'd seen how she struck. He'd seen why the instructor corrected her every time. And he'd seen why she slipped back into her old form every time. Because her body knows. Her body remembers some old-school technique that doesn't match what they teach at the guild. A standard swordsman's stance is to put weight on the heel. Hannah puts her weight on her entire foot. Lower, wider, rougher. Like a longshoreman. My cousin is right in his description, but he's wrong in his assessment. She doesn't strike like a longshoreman. She strikes like someone who's used to working with heavy loads, with the ground, with weight. This isn't a weakness. It's a different school. A forgotten one. A discarded one. Like a skill erased from the panel. Ethan stood in the hallway and felt that familiar itch in his head, the same one that would appear when he saw merchandise in the warehouse that wasn't on its proper shelf. Hannah was on someone else's shelf. She'd been taught someone else's technique, but her own was inside her. Unmapped, unnamed. He went back to work. That evening in the back room, he opened a notebook, a new page, a title, Project Hannah. Phase 1, Gathering Components. He began searching the servant's absorbed library for what he needed, ancient hand-to-hand and blade combat techniques that drew their power from the earth, from weight, from heaviness, the ones that standard swordsmen discarded first because they considered them crude. He found 42 scraps that first evening. By the end of the week, there were 112. He wasn't collecting them. Not yet. He was hoarding them. and waiting. Because before he could assemble a technique for another person, he needed to understand one thing: have it transfer a skill gathered in a servant to someone on the outside. A servant could gather, could fuse, could store, but could it give? Ethan didn't know. The answer to the question came by chance. Ethan hadn't planned the experiment. He was mopping the floor in the hallway outside the pharmacy near the guild. The servant was standing against the wall. A girl came out of the pharmacy holding a small clay jar. 17 years old. A calm face. Her hair was tied back in a bun. She wore a herbalist's apron. She walked past Ethan and stopped. She looked at the servant, then at Ethan, then back at the servant. Ethan froze. She wasn't supposed to see anything. The servant stood silently. He wasn't doing anything, but the girl looked at him as if she had seen something. She asked how long he had that creature. Ethan replied that he had it since the ceremony. She nodded. She asked if his head hurt in the evenings. Ethan didn't answer right away, because his head did hurt in the evenings, every evening after the gathering. A dull, throbbing pain behind his eyes. He chalked it up to fatigue. She looked at him and waited. He said sometimes. She took a small bundle out of her apron pocket. She unwrapped it. Inside was dry grass, dark, with a bitter smell. She told him to brew a pinch in a cup before bed, that it relieves mana backlash. Ethan took the bundle. He asked how she knew about backlash. She replied that she could see it. Her class, silent palm, allowed her to sense mana overloads in living beings from a distance. Ethan looked like a man who spent more mana every day than he had. That was true. The connection to his servant cost mana. Every time he absorbed pollen, it cost mana. Every assembly cost mana. Ethan was paying for everything his servant did out of his own pocket. He just didn't notice because he was used to it. His body had grown accustomed to the constant pain and stopped sending signals. He asked her name. Yuma Kim, 17 years old. An herbalist at the guild's apothecary. Class, silent palm, specializing in restoring mana after overloads. He thanked her for the herb. She nodded and left. Ethan brewed the herb that evening. The pain was gone within 20 minutes. He slept peacefully for the first time in a month. The next day, he returned to the pharmacy. Not for herbs, for information. Yuna was working behind the counter. He asked if she could explain exactly how mana drain works for a summoner. She explained, calmly, in detail, without beating around the bush. A summoner pays for a creature with a constant flow of mana. The more active the creature, the higher the consumption. If consumption exceeds regeneration, mana drain begins. Headache, nausea, weakness. If consumption is significantly higher, fainting. If critical, death. Ethan listened and took notes, not in a notebook, in his head. He asked what would happen if a creature consumed mana, but the panel didn't detect it. Yuna paused. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said she didn't understand the question. Ethan rephrased it. What if mana is being consumed, but the system log is empty? Yuna was silent. Then she said that was impossible. The panel tracks all consumption. Ethan nodded and left. She watched him go. 3 days later, he came back. He'd fainted. He conducted a major assembly that morning. 147 components, the largest one at that. The servant received a device Ethan called Long Ear, the ability to hear conversations from a distance of up to 50 meters with noise filtering. The after effects hit an hour later. Ethan managed to make it to the pharmacy and sit down on a step. Then the world went dark. He woke up inside, on a bench against the wall. Yuna was sitting next to him, holding his wrist. Her fingers were warm. She was checking his pulse. He tried to sit up. She told him not to move. He didn't move. She was silent for 5 minutes. Then she said his mana consumption was twice the normal rate for a 1-star summoner, that his creature was consuming as much as a 3-star creature would, that this was impossible for a nameless servant, and that she wouldn't ask why, but that if he continued at this rate, he would die in 6 months. Ethan lay on the bench and stared at the ceiling. 6 months, he thought. In his past life, he worked 12 hours a day, and his boss had said he'd burn out. He hadn't burned out. He got hit by a bus. A different kind of death. He sat up. Yuna didn't try to stop him. She saw his eyes and realized he couldn't be stopped. He said he couldn't stop. She was silent. Then she said that in that case, she would come to see him every evening, with tincture, to keep him going, not for treatment, so he wouldn't die before he finished what he was doing. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't showing sympathy. She spoke like a doctor who had made a decision and wasn't going to discuss it. He nodded. From that day on, Yuna came to the back room every evening. With a small clay jar. The tincture was bitter and smelled of earth. She set the jar on the table. Ethan drank. Yuna checked his pulse. Then she left. Sometimes she stayed for 5 minutes. Sometimes for 20. They hardly spoke. But her presence changed something. Ethan couldn't explain what. It was just that the evenings became a little warmer. By the 3rd week of their acquaintance, Ethan made up his mind. He sat in the back room and looked at the notebook. The page of the question that had been tormenting him ever since he'd started thinking about the Hannah project. Could a servant pass on the technique they'd mastered to another person? A servant collects pollen, fuses it into a technique, stores it within themselves, uses it themselves. But could they give it away? Theoretically, a skill is energy. Energy can be transferred. Contact. A touch. Maybe. He called the servant over, placed him in front of him, said, "Give me your hand." The servant held out his hand. Ethan took his palm. He closed his eyes. He focused on the connection. He found one of the techniques inside the servant, the weakest one, a passive shield. And he tried to draw it out, channeling it through the servant's hand into his own. Nothing happened. He tried again, differently, not pulling it toward himself, to push it away from the servant, through the point of contact, like pouring water from one glass into another. He could feel the technique inside the servant. He could feel its shape, its weight, but it didn't move. It was embedded in the servant, part of him. He couldn't extract it without destroying it. Ethan let go of the hand. He sat down. He thought. You can't transfer something that's already assembled inside the servant. The technique becomes part of the being, so another way is needed. Not to pass on what's already complete, but to assemble something new from the outside. He opened his notebook. He began to draw. What if the servant fused the components not inside itself, but on the outside? It would extract the pollen, form a thread, and pass the thread to another person before it entered the servant. He wrote down the idea, circled it, put a question mark, then 3 question marks. Then he crossed them out and wrote experiment number 1, transfer of unlinked techniques. He needed a test subject, not Ji-eun. She wasn't a player in the full sense of the word. Her class didn't involve learning combat techniques. Not Sojin. Too soon. Too risky. If something went wrong, he couldn't afford to harm a veteran. He needed someone who wouldn't raise any questions. Someone the panel wasn't keeping a close eye on. Someone small. Someone like him. The next day, he found Park Da-hee. He wasn't looking for her on purpose. She found him. He was mopping the floor in a storage room on the 1st floor. The door was open. A girl his age walked by. 12 years old, small, quiet, wearing a janitor's uniform. The same bucket, the same rag. She walked past without looking at him. Ethan glanced at her panel. Park Da-hee, 12 years old. Class, observer. Starter card rank, 1 star. 1 star observer. The second most useless class after summoner. Ethan continued washing. The next day he saw her again. She was washing the floor in the adjacent hallway. Silently. Expressionless. She worked carefully but somehow detached, as if she were here and not here at the same time. Ethan watched her for 3 days. Da-hee didn't talk to anyone. Not with the other janitors. Not with the players. Not with the maintenance manager. She did her work and disappeared. No one noticed her. She was invisible. On the 4th day, Ethan noticed something strange. Da-hee was standing in the hallway by the training hall. She wasn't mopping. She was just standing there. She was staring at the wall. But not at the wall. Past the wall. Through the wall. Her eyes were unfocused, like someone looking at something very far away, or at something that isn't there. Ethan stopped. He watched her for 15 seconds. She blinked. She turned back, picked up the rag, continued washing, as if nothing had happened. Ethan thought, class, observer. 1 star. What does the observer see? The panel didn't say. The class description in the system catalog was empty. 1 line. Class. Observer. Ability. Observation. That's all. No details. No parameters. No skill tree. As if the panel itself didn't know what kind of class this was, or didn't want to know. He watched Da-hee for another week. Every day she would stop at least once. She looked through the wall, or through the floor, or through the ceiling. Her eyes would go out of focus for 3 or 5 seconds. Then she'd come back and continue working. No one noticed, except Ethan. On the 10th day of observation, something happened that he hadn't expected. He was sitting in the back room that evening, working on a notebook. The servant was standing in the corner, quietly digesting his daily portion of pollen. A piece of paper slid under the door. Ethan picked it up, unfolded it. A note. A child's handwriting. Clumsy. One sentence. Your servant doesn't just eat dust. I see it too. Ethan read it, reread it. A third time. Then he laughed. Out loud. For the first time in a very long time in this world. He laughed because the note was perfect. It said two things. First, Dahi sees what the servant is doing. Second, she sees the pollen too, or something like it. Her observer class allows her to see system anomalies. The servant is an anomaly. The pollen is an anomaly. Dahi sees both, and she'd been silent for 3 months. She observed, as her class requires. Ethan opened the door to the storage room. The hallway was empty. Dahi was gone. He closed the door, sat down, looked at the note, and realized he hadn't found a test subject for the experiment. He found something more important, a witness. The only person besides himself who could see the underside of the system. The next morning, he approached her in the storage room. She was mopping the floor. He stood beside her. He started mopping too, in silence. After 5 minutes, he said without turning around, "What do you see when you look through the walls?" Dahi didn't stop. She kept scrubbing. She was silent for a full minute. Then she answered, quietly, almost in a whisper. Lines. She sees lines. They run down from the panel to every player. Thin, almost invisible, lines of control. The panel watches everyone. It counts every skill, every action, every step. But Ethan's servant has no line. He's empty. To the panel, he doesn't exist. Ethan stopped washing. He looked at her. She looked at him. It was the first time their eyes met. Her eyes were dark and deep. The transfer experiment took 3 weeks. Ethan started with the theory. If a servant cannot surrender technology that is already embedded within him, then the technology must be reassembled. Not inside the servant, but on the outside. The servant stores the absorbed pollen in a dark chamber inside himself. Fused technologies become part of his body, but unfused pollen lies scattered. So the pollen can be removed before fusion. First attempt. Ethan asked the servant to take a handful of unfused pollen and push it out through his palm. The servant closed his eyes. He held out his hand. Nothing. The pollen didn't come out. It was inside. It didn't want to come out. Second attempt. Ethan changed his approach. Not to push the pollen out, but to fuse it in the servant's palm and release a thread outward before it entered the body. To hold it back at the exit, like holding a door shut. He explained this to the servant through the connection, not with words, with images. Imagine you're molding a ball of clay, but don't swallow it. Hold it in your hand. The servant tried. Ethan felt through the connection how inside the creature, 20 grains of pollen rose and began to merge. A thread began to form. It moved toward the servant's center, toward the spot where it was embedding itself in his body. Ethan mentally shouted, "Stop." Not inside, into your hand. The thread froze. It twitched. It turned. It slowly moved toward his palm. The servant held out his hand. A point of light appeared in his palm, small, pulsating, warm. Ethan stared at it. The thread wasn't stable. It trembled. It was fraying at the edges. He had a few seconds. He grabbed the servant's hand with his own, pressed his palm against the servant's palm, and felt the warmth pass into him, through the skin, through the bones, through the muscles. A small flash somewhere deep inside. The panel flashed. A single line. Unknown effect detected. Type, undetermined. Duration, undetermined. That was all. The panel didn't know what it was. It couldn't classify it. It displayed a question mark and fell silent. Ethan let go of the servant's hand. He looked at his own palm, an ordinary palm, nothing visible, but he could feel it. There was something new inside, small, faint, like a seed. 20 grains of pollen fused into a single thread and transmitted through the contact. What was it? He checked. Passive reading, plus 3%. Junk by any standard. But it was inside him, not in the servant, inside him. And the panel didn't know what to make of it. He jotted it down in his notebook. Experiment number 1. Success. Transmission via palm-to-palm contact. Condition. The thread must be formed but not embedded. Transmission window. 3 to 5 seconds. Transmission loss, approximately 30%. Out of 20 grains, 14 reached him effectively. The panel records this as an unknown effect. He sat and looked at the entry. 30% loss. That's a lot. But not critical. It can be compensated for by the number of components. If a servant requires 40 grains and 60 are needed for transmission, more raw materials, more time, but the result is the same. He could create devices for other people. A week later, he conducted his second experiment. On himself. 50 components. A passive ability affecting reaction speed. Transmission loss, 28%. The result was noticeable. He became slightly quicker at detecting movement in his peripheral vision. The panel displayed a question mark again. Third experiment. 70 components. A passive ability affecting stamina. 25% loss. It worked. The loss decreased with each attempt. The servant was learning to maintain the connection more steadily. Ethan was learning to receive it faster. They were tuning into each other, like a mechanism. By the end of the third week, Ethan was ready. Not for himself, for Hannah. He had gathered 112 components, old techniques from hand-to-hand and blade-fighting schools that drew their power from the ground. From weight, from gravity, the load-bearing schools. Forgotten styles, discarded methods. No one remembered their names. No one knew they had ever existed. Ethan found them in the dust. Fragments of others' erased skills. He fused them into a single thread. Not inside the servant, at the exit. The thread was dense, heavy. It pulsed with dark gold. The servant held it in his palm and his hand trembled with tension. Ethan wrapped the thread in a piece of cloth. The cloth grew warm. The thread could last outside the servant for about an hour. Then it would begin to crumble. He put the bundle in his pocket. He went to look for Hannah. He found her on the roof of the guild. She was sitting alone, looking out at the city. The calluses on her wrists were fresh. Her eyes were red, not from tears. Ethan walked over and sat down beside her. She looked at him irritably and asked what he wanted. He said he had a gift for her. She snorted and said she didn't need gifts from an assistant. He wasn't offended. He took out a bundle, unwrapped it. A thread pulsed through the fabric. Hannah stared at it. She asked what it was. Ethan said it was for school. It had always been there. It's just that no one had ever named it. Hannah didn't understand. Ethan explained, briefly, without going into detail. He said he'd seen her training. He'd seen her stance. He'd seen how the instructor corrected her every time. And he saw that she slipped back into her old form every time. Not because she wasn't listening, because her body knew a different way. An old one, a forgotten one. He pieced that way together, from the fragments, from what others had thrown away. He put it all together. It became a technique. Not standard, not from a catalog. Hers, personal, tailored to her stance, to her weight, to her strike. Hannah looked at the string, then at Ethan, then back at the string. She didn't believe it. She couldn't believe it. A 12-year-old errand boy with a bucket was telling her he put together a fighting technique for her, made from trash. She said he was crazy. He said maybe, but the device works. If she wants to test it, let her take the string in her hand. If she doesn't want to, he'll leave. Hannah was silent for 10 seconds. Then she held out her hand. Ethan placed the string in her palm. The string flared up. Warmth coursed through Hannah's skin. She flinched. She closed her eyes, opened them, looked at her hands. Then she stood up, slowly. She stood in a stance, not the one the instructor had taught her, but her own. Wide, low, heavy. Hannah came to see him the next day. Not on the roof, in the storage room, during his shift. She opened the door, went in, closed it behind her. Ethan was sitting on a box sorting scrolls. Hannah stood in front of him. She stood there in silence for 30 seconds. Then she said that she'd been training until midnight yesterday, that the technique was working, that for the first time in her life she didn't feel out of place in her own stance, that she wanted to know where it came from. Ethan looked at her. She wasn't angry. She was serious, quiet. It was unusual. Jean had said that Hannah swears in 3 dialects and is never quiet. Right now, she was quiet. Ethan said he couldn't explain everything, only part of it, that he had a way of finding old, forgotten techniques that other players had discarded, that he could piece together new ones from them, that he put together a set for her that suited her style. Hannah listened. Then she asked why. Why for her? Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about how to put it. Then he said he'd seen a person being put on someone else's shelf, and that it annoyed him. She didn't understand the part about the shelf, but she got the main point. He'd seen that something was wrong with her, and instead of fixing her, he fixed the instrument. She was silent for a minute. Then she said that if he needed help, she was there. Not for the equipment, just there. Ethan nodded. Hannah turned and walked away. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said that if anyone laid a hand on him, she'd break that person's both arms. Then she walked out. Ethan smirked. From that day on, Hannah came to training in the evenings, not to the gym, to the guild's backyard. Ethan stood by the wall and watched. A servant stood nearby. Hannah practiced her stance, her own. Low. Heavy. Without an instructor, without rules. Ethan would sometimes say a single phrase, heel to the left, or elbow lower, or weight back. Hannah would follow his instructions. She asked how he knew. He replied that he could see. She'd curse and keep going. After a week of training together, Ethan began work on the Sojeon project. He knew the problem, hand tremors when drawing on mana. Sojeon had lost a link 5 years ago. Ever since then, his hands had trembled, not from fear, but from mana damage. When his entire link perished, Sojeon had attempted to use a forbidden technique. He tried to channel his entire mana reserve into a single strike to seal the gate. He sealed it, but the channels in his hands burned out. Ever since then, his hands would start to tremble whenever he exerted mana. He could teach, he could demonstrate, but he couldn't hold his spear in battle. Ethan didn't learn this from Sojeon. Sojeon never spoke of it. Ethan found it in old reports that Sojeon himself had brought him. In one of the reports from the year before last, there was a line. Combat Readiness Assessment of Instructors. Min Sojeon. Status. Limitedly fit. Reason. Damage to the mana channels in the upper limbs. Ethan read it and memorized it. Then he began searching. He didn't need combat techniques. He needed stabilization passives, techniques that compensate for tremors and balance the flow of mana in damaged channels. They don't heal, they compensate. He began a targeted search. It was more difficult than with Hannah. Stabilization passives were rare. They weren't removed often, mostly by veteran players who were changing their playstyle or retiring. Ethan waited. He kept track. Every day, 1 to 3 such fragments would appear in the square by the guild and inside the building. The rest were combat-oriented and utility-based. He collected them one by one. 1 on Monday, none on Tuesday, 2 on Wednesday, 19 by the end of the first week, 41 by the end of the second, 103 by the end of the month. Not enough. For a fully functional compensatory technique, he needed at least 200. He kept at it. At the same time, he was working on Yuna's project. Phase 0, problem analysis. Yuna's mother was ill. Her mana. The body stops maintaining its baseline mana level. The body weakens. Organs fail. Without treatment, death within 3 to 5 years. A cure exists. Diamond players with top-tier healing skills can restore mana channels. The cost? Astronomical. Yuna would never be able to afford it. Ethan thought. He wasn't a healer. He was a collector. But what if you could assemble a healing technique from the dust? Basic healing spells were the most common category of deletes. Newbies deleted them by the dozens. Every day. Individually, each one was trash. Plus 1% to regeneration. Plus 0.5% to mana recovery. Drops in the ocean. But 1,000 drops is a stream. And if that stream is directed exactly where it's needed. Ethan jotted it down in his notebook. Project Yuna. Phase 1. Collecting basic healing spells. Target volume, 1,300 units. Deadline, 6 months. 1,300. The number was enormous, but the flow was steady. Every day, between 50 and 80 scraps of healing passed through the guild. Ethan sent his servant to intercept them. He was running 3 projects simultaneously. Sojeon, Yuna, and the main one, servant development. His notebook was swelling. He started a 3rd one. Evenings in the back room were getting longer. Jin came by with new data. Sojeon came by with tea. Yuna came by with tincture. Dahi didn't come by. She left notes. Short. Precise. Today, on the 3rd floor, an anomaly in the mage's line from the east wing. Or, tomorrow at noon, an inspector from the capital's headquarters will arrive. The lines around the reception area will get crowded. She saw things that no one else saw, and she reported them to Ethan. Silently. Through paper. He didn't ask how she knew about the inspector a day before his arrival. She saw the lines. The lines changed when something in the system changed. The inspector was that change. Dahi sensed it. In his 4th month working at the guild, Ethan conducted his first transmission for Sojeon. Not a complete one. A test run. He gathered 103 stabilization passives and fused them into a thread. The thread was thin, weak. Not a fully fledged technique, more like a prototype. He came to Sojin in the evening. Sojin was sitting in the training room, alone. A spear lay on the table. His hands lay next to the spear. They were trembling. Ethan sat down across from him. He placed a small bundle on the table. Sojin looked at the bundle, then at Ethan. Ethan said that it didn't cure the cause. It compensated for the symptom. If Sojin agreed to live with the compensation, his hands would stop trembling. Not forever, just for a while, as long as the technology worked. He said this was a trial version. The full version would be ready in 2 months, once he gathered enough components. Sojin stared at the bundle for a long time. Then he picked it up. He unwrapped it. The thread pulsed with a silvery glow. He took it in his hand. The thread sank into his skin. Warmth spread up through his fingers toward his shoulders. Sojin raised his hands. He looked at them. They weren't shaking. For the first time in 5 years, he slowly picked up the spear from the table. He gripped the shaft with both hands. He stood up. He assumed his fighting stance. Spearman of the Northern Outpost, gold rank. 5 years without a battle. He stood with the spear in his hands, and his hands weren't trembling. Ethan saw something snap on Sojin's face. Not a mask, something deeper. Something he'd been holding inside for 5 years. Sojin lowered the spear. He sat down. He placed his hands on the table. They began to tremble again. The effect lasted 4 minutes. A prototype. Weak. Temporary. But 4 minutes without trembling. Sojin sat there, staring at his hands. Then he looked at Ethan. Ethan said the full version would be stable. Hours, maybe days. It would take time. Sojin nodded, silently. He stood up, picked up his spear, left. He stopped at the door. Without turning around, he said, "Thank you." One word. The first word Sojin had ever said to Ethan. Ethan remained alone in the coaching room. He looked at the empty table. He thought. 2 months until the full version. He still needed 100 components. And at the same time, 1,300 for Yuna. And at the same time, the servant's development. And at the same time, the assistant's work. And on top of that, Hannah. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. His head ached. A relapse. Yuna would bring the tincture in an hour. He left the coaching room and headed to the supply room. On the way, he saw Dahi in the hallway. She was standing against the wall staring at the ceiling. Her gaze was unfocused. She was seeing something. When Ethan walked past, she said quietly without turning around, "The lines on the 3rd floor have gotten thicker. One of the seniors is doing something strange with the equipment. Every night." Ethan stopped. He asked who exactly. Dahi said, "The senior treasurer, Han Myung-ho." Ethan jotted down the name and kept walking. Ethan didn't start tailing the treasurer right away. He knew that rushing into an investigation was a rookie mistake. Instead, he asked Ji-yoon to pull up the guild's financial reports for the past 5 years. Ji-yoon asked why. Ethan said he wanted to understand the structure of their expenses. She didn't believe him, but brought them anyway. 7 folders. Ethan read them for 3 nights in a row. On the 2nd night, he found the first oddity. Every quarter, funds were transferred from the guild's budget to an account labeled Support for Missing Members. The amount was small enough not to attract attention, but it was consistent. Every quarter, for 20 years. Ethan did the math. Over 20 years, enough money had passed through this account to enough to equip 30 silver-ranked players. He found the list of those missing. 84 names over 20 years. 84 players from the Silver Fang Guild had been declared missing after dungeon raids. No bodies were found. The investigations were closed. In all 84 cases, the closure was signed by one person, Senior Treasurer Han Myung-ho. Ethan jotted this down in his notebook and underlined it. Then he asked Dahi to keep an eye on the treasurer for a week. Dahi nodded. A week later, she brought a note longer than usual. 3 lines. Every night, the treasurer goes up to the 3rd floor. He enters the archive room. The lines around him change color. They turn black. For 10 minutes. Then they return to normal. He leaves. He goes home. Black lines. Ethan didn't know what that meant. Neither did Dahi. She saw the lines but didn't always understand their meaning. The black ones were new. She hadn't seen them on anyone before. Ethan asked Ji-yoon to check who had access to the archive room on the 3rd floor. Ji-yoon checked. 3 people. The guild master, the senior treasurer, and the archive administrator who had resigned 6 years ago and hadn't been replaced. Ethan made a note of it. Then he asked a servant to stand by the staircase leading to the 3rd floor at night. Not near the archive room, by the staircase. 30 meters away, within the absorption radius. If the treasurer were to remove something from the panel in the archive room, the servant could detect it. The first night, the servant stood by the stairs for 4 hours. Nothing. The second night, nothing. The third night, at 2 in the morning, the servant absorbed 1 unit of pollen, a special kind. Not red, not green, not blue. White, with a black dot in the center. Ethan woke up from a sensation through the link, like a jolt of cold. He sat up on his bedding, closed his eyes, looked through the servant. The speck lay in the dark room inside the creature, white with a black dot. It didn't resemble any of the 10,000 units collected earlier. It was different. Ethan tried to read it. Through the connection, through the servant. And he saw it. Not a skill. Not a passive ability. A trace. An imprint. Like a fingerprint on glass. Someone had erased not a skill from the panel, but something else. Something the panel classified differently. A tag. A system tag. Ethan didn't know what a system tag was, but he knew one thing. Every night, the treasurer came to the archive and erased 1 tag at a time from the panel, and these tags were connected to the black lines that Dahi had seen. He jotted it down in his notebook. Question: what is a system tag? Question: why does the treasurer erase them? Question: is this connected to the 84 missing people? He couldn't find the answers right away. It took another 2 months. For 2 months, every night he stationed a servant by the staircase. Every night, the servant caught 1 or 2 white specks with a black dot. By the end of the first month, there were 23. By the end of the second, 47. Ethan studied each one, through the connection, through the servant. Each one contained a trace, not a skill, a person. Each white speck was an imprint of someone's panel, someone's life, someone's name. On the 40th day, Ethan was able to read the first name. Kim Tae-hyun, 17 years old, spearman class, bronze rank. Status: missing for 14 years. Ethan checked the list. Kim Tae-hyun was on the list of 84, number 37. He read the second name, the third, the fifth. They all matched. They were all on the list. The treasurer erases the marks of the missing, not from their panels. They were dead. From the system archive. He was erasing the records that they had ever existed at all. Ethan sat in the back room at 3 in the morning staring at the notebook. 47 names out of 84. Each of these people had existed. Each had a name, a class, a rank, a life. And someone was erasing them from the system. Not from people's memories, from the panel, from the records, from the world itself. Why? Ethan wondered. If you erase records of a person's existence, it means you don't want anyone to be able to trace what happened to them. If you don't want them traced, it means you're involved in their disappearance. If you're involved in 84 disappearances over 20 years. Ethan closed the notebook. He looked at the servant. The servant was standing in the corner staring at him. For the first time, Ethan saw something in his eyes. Not emptiness. A heaviness. The servant carried within him 47 imprints of dead people, and he could feel it. Ethan said quietly, "We won't rush. We'll gather all 84, then we'll decide what to do." He didn't say what he was feeling, but he was feeling anger. Quiet, cold anger. Not the kind that drives you into battle, but the kind that makes you sit and count and not make a mistake. At the same time, he continued working on his other projects. 5 months after starting work at the guild, the Sojion project was completed. 214 stabilization passives, fused into a single thread. Dense. Stable. A fully fledged technique. Ethan went to see Sojion in the training room. He placed the bundle on the table. Sojion unwrapped it. He took the strand. Warmth flowed into his hands. He raised them. They weren't trembling. He picked up the spear, stood up, assumed his stance, froze. He stood there for a minute, 2, 5. His hands weren't trembling. He lunged forward. The spear sliced through the air. Cleanly. Precisely. Just like 5 years ago. Sojion lowered the spear. He sat down. His hands rested on his knees. They weren't trembling. He sat there for a long time. Then he looked at Ethan. And Ethan saw something he hadn't expected. Sojion was crying. Silently. Without a sound. Tears ran down the scar across his eyebrow and dripped onto his hands, which were still for the first time in 5 years. Ethan stood up. He walked out of the coaching room. He closed the door. He gave Sojion some time. An hour later, Sojion came out, a spear in his hand. He walked toward the training ground. Ethan stood in the hallway and watched him go. In the morning, So-jian came to practice. The instructors looked at his hands, silently. Then one of them asked. So-jian didn't explain anything. He simply demonstrated the spear stance, a full one, without a tremor. 2 days later, rumors began to spread throughout the guild that the old instructor had recovered, that it was a miracle, that some herbalist was involved. No one thought of the assistant with the bucket. By the 6th month, Ethan had finished gathering materials for Yuna's project, 1,311 basic healing spells. Collected over half a year. Each one on its own was junk, plus 1% to regeneration, plus 0.5% to mana regeneration. He fused them together. The process took hours, not minutes. The servant stood in the back room with his eyes closed for 6 hours. Ethan sat nearby and guided him through the link. 1,311 fragments rose up inside the servant. They collided. They repelled each other. Then they converged again. Ethan arranged them layer by layer, like a wall, like a building. The foundation, the framework, the walls, the roof. The healing technique could not be rough. It had to be precise, gentle, like a doctor's hands. He built it exactly that way. By morning, the thread was ready, thick, green, pulsing with living warmth. The servant held it in both palms. His hands trembled with tension. Ethan wrapped the thread in cloth, placed it in a small bundle. He went to the pharmacy. Yuna was standing behind the counter. He placed the bundle in front of her. She looked at it, unwrapped it. She saw the thread. She looked up at him. He said it wasn't a guarantee. It was a chance. That the thread contained a healing technique pieced together from 1,300 fragments of basic healing. That he didn't know if it would be enough to help her mother. That if it wasn't enough, he would put another one together. And another. As many as needed. Yuna held the bundle. Her hands, which had always been steady and calm, were trembling. She looked up. Her eyes were wet. She couldn't say anything. She just stood there, holding the bundle. Then she said one word quietly. I understand. And she tucked the bundle into her apron pocket. Ethan nodded. He turned away. He left. In the hallway, he was overcome. A relapse. 6 hours of alloying. 1,300 components. He paid for it with everything he had. His knees buckled. He fell to the floor. The world spun. Darkness. He woke up on a bench in the pharmacy. Yuna was sitting next to him. The tincture was on the table. She already poured him the first dose. He lay there staring at the ceiling. Yuna was silent. An hour later, he was able to stand up. She walked him to the back room. She stopped at the door. She said the device was working, that she tested it on herself, that the healing wave was steady and gentle, that she'd take it to her mother tomorrow, that she didn't know how to thank him. Ethan said there was no need to thank him, that it was his job. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was a strange boy, and that she was glad he was strange, and she left. The 7th month. Ethan had 84 names. All of them. Every night the servant stood by the stairs on the 3rd floor. Every night the treasurer came and erased the marks. By the 70th day of observation, the servant had collected all the marks that the treasurer had erased. 84 white specks with a black dot. 84 names. 84 lives. Ethan sat in the back room and looked at the list. He copied the names into a notebook. The left column, the name. The right column, the date of disappearance. The earliest entry, 20 years ago. The first year after the panel's appearance. The latest entry, 11 months ago. The treasurer hadn't stopped. He kept going. Ethan examined each print through his connection with the servant. Each one contained not only a name, but also the last skill the person had erased before death, not before disappearing. Before death. Ethan was now certain. They hadn't gone missing. They had died. And the treasurer knew it, because he himself had sent them away. Ethan compiled the data into a table. 84 people. They all followed the same pattern. Before disappearing, each one erased the exact same combination of skills from the panel. 3 skills, always 3, in a specific order. First, basic shield. Second, sleep passive. Third, subjugation technique. Subjugation technique. Ethan read this and froze. He hadn't come across such techniques in the panel's catalog. It wasn't a standard skill. It was something the treasurer gave to the victims. He gave it and then took it back, or forced them to erase it. 3 skills. A shield so the victim wouldn't die along the way. Sleep so the victim wouldn't resist. Subjugation so the victim would go where they were told. And then all 3 were erased. a clean sweep, so that the panel wouldn't show that the person was carrying something unusual. Ethan closed his notebook. According to his documents, he was 12 years old, 26 in his memory. He sat in the guild's back room and looked at a list of 84 names, people whom the 68-year-old treasurer had been sending to their deaths for 20 years. And he wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about how the treasurer erased the marks every night. Every single one. 22 years. That's not the behavior of a killer who doesn't care. It's the behavior of a man who remembers every name and can't live with it. Yet he keeps going anyway. Why? Ethan didn't know, but he was going to find out. He didn't go to the treasurer right away. He prepared himself. 2 weeks. He asked Jiun to pull up Han Myung-ho's personal file. Born 68 years ago, according to the documents. According to the system data, he was 88, a 20-year discrepancy. Someone had altered his age in the panel, or the panel had made a mistake. Or he was one of those who had been here before the panel, and the panel hadn't been able to calculate his age correctly. Family. Wig. Died during the panel's first year. 2 children. The eldest son. Killed in the first year. The younger son. 7 years old at the time of his death. He was killed too, in the first year. All 3 were killed by a gang of early players who took advantage of the chaos of the early days. The panel had just appeared. There were no laws. There were no guilds. People acquired skills and did whatever they wanted. Gangs wiped out entire neighborhoods. Han Myung-ho's family lived in one of those neighborhoods. Ethan read this and felt a chill in his chest. Not anger, understanding. The treasurer lost everything in a single day. His wife, his 2 children, his home. And yet he survived. For 20 years he sat at a table in the guild, counting other people's money. And every night he erased the marks of the people he himself had sent to their deaths. Why? For what purpose? Ethan found the answer in the last imprint. The 47th grain. The oldest. The first of 84. 20 years ago. Name, Kan Soo-jin. Age, 7. Class, undetermined. Ceremony not completed. Rank, none. The treasurer's youngest son. Ethan read the name and sat down. The youngest son was first on the list, not as a victim, but as the first name the treasurer began to erase. Not because he had killed him, but because someone had promised to bring him back. Ethan closed his eyes. The sect of the empty panel. Dahi had mentioned black lines. Lines that did not belong to the panel. Lines that came from somewhere else. From below. From beneath the system. The sect believed that the panel was a prison. That there was something else beyond the panel. That the dead did not vanish but ended up inside the system. And that they could be pulled out, if a price was paid. 84 living souls for 1 dead one. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the list. 84 names. 20 years. An old man who had lost his 7-year-old son and believed for 20 years that if he brought enough souls, they would return the boy to him. Ethan stood up. He looked at the servant. The servant was standing in the corner. Heavy. He carried 84 imprints within him. 84 final traces of people who had erased the subjugation technique from the panel a second before their lives ended. Ethan said quietly, "It's time." He took the notebook, a list of names. He left the back room. It was 10 o'clock in the evening. The guild was almost empty. He went up to the 3rd floor. He walked down the hallway. He stopped in front of the treasurer's office door. He knocked. Silence. Then a voice. Old, dry. "Who is it?" Ethan said his name. The door opened. Han Myung-ho stood in the doorway. Tall. Thin. His face deeply lined. His eyes clear. He looked at Ethan, an assistant, with a notebook. At 10 o'clock at night, he asked what Ethan wanted. Ethan said he wanted to talk. The treasurer let him in. The office was small. A desk. 2 chairs. Shelves of folders. An oil lamp. A cup of cold tea on the table. Ethan sat down in the chair across from him. He placed the notebook on the table, opened it to the page with the list, turned it toward the treasurer. Han Myung-ho looked at the list. His expression didn't change. He read slowly, from top to bottom, name by name, 84 lines. When he reached the last one, he looked up at Ethan. He asked where it came from. Ethan replied that his servant collects what others erase, that each of these people, before dying, had erased something from the panel. The servant had picked it up and memorized it. The treasurer was silent for a long time. He looked at the list, then at his own hands. Old, dry, spotted. Then at the first name on the list. Kan Soo-jin, 7 years old. His fingers trembled on the paper. Ethan waited. The treasurer spoke softly. He said the first name was his youngest son, that he was 7, that he had only just acquired the panel, that he died in his father's arms during his first year, that the sect came to him a month after the funeral, that they said his son's consciousness hadn't vanished, that it was inside the polygon, that he could be brought back if he brought them 84 people, that he had believed them for 20 years. For 20 years, he had led young players to them. He had reported them missing. He had erased the tags. He had covered up the traces. And every night you would go to the archives and delete another record because he couldn't bear to see their names in the system, knowing what he had done to them. The treasurer remained silent. Ethan sat across from him and listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He listened. When the treasurer finished, Ethan said one thing. He said he knew where his son's consciousness was right now. The treasurer looked up. His eyes were red. Ethan said that his servant had extracted an imprint of Han's Sujin from pollen, that the imprint contained a trace of consciousness, not complete, just a fragment, but enough to establish contact, not to return him to his body. That's impossible. But to give him a chance to say goodbye, to hear his voice, just once. Not today, in a year, when the servant had gathered enough energy for contact at that level, if the treasurer was willing to wait. Han Myung-ho looked at him, at the 12-year-old boy who had come to his office at night with a notebook in his hands and a list of 84 names, who knew everything, who didn't cry, didn't threaten, didn't go to the guild master, who brought tea. Ethan took a small packet of herbal tea out of his pocket, the one Yuna gave him every evening, and brewed it in a cup on the treasurer's desk. He set it in front of him. Han Myung-ho looked at the cup, at the list, at the cup. Then his face began to crack, slowly. Like a wall pounded by water for 20 years. First a crack, then a second. Then everything came crashing down. He began to cry, not like a child, like an old man who hadn't cried in 20 years and had forgotten how to do it, quietly, terrifyingly, with a wheeze. Ethan sat across from him. He said nothing. He waited. He didn't touch him. He didn't comfort him. He was simply there. The tea grew cold on the table. Night lay outside the window. The pain pulse blew. The treasurer was crying. Ethan waited. The morning after his conversation with the treasurer was quiet. Ethan hadn't slept all night. He sat in the back room until dawn, staring at the list of names. 84 lines. 84 people. Each of them had once stood in these hallways, cleaned their weapons, bought scrolls, laughed in the dining hall, and then they disappeared. Ethan closed the notebook. He stood up. He washed his face with cold water from a bucket. He looked at the servant. The servant was standing in the corner, watching him. A heavy gaze. 84 fingerprints inside. 84 names. Ethan said quietly, "Today will begin the next phase." He left the back room and went to the guild master. Not to the treasurer, not to Sogen. To the master, directly. It was risky. Ethan knew that revealing himself to the guild master meant the end of his quiet life as a backroom worker. But that quiet life was already coming to an end anyway. The treasurer knew that Ethan knew. Sooner or later, the empty panel sect would find out that their channel into the guild had been exposed. Ethan needed protection, official protection, and the only person who could provide it was the master, the guild master, Silver Fang. Quan Changsu, 52 years old, gold rank, heavy shield class, a massive man with a shaved head and arms like logs. He'd been running the guild for 20 years. Honest, rough around the edges. He wouldn't tolerate lies. Ethan knocked on the master's office door at 7 in the morning. The master opened it. He looked at the assistant with the bucket. He asked what Ethan wanted. Ethan said he needed to talk. In private. The master let him in. The office was large. A dark wooden table. A spear and a shield on the wall. Trophies. Ethan sat down in a chair. The master sat across from him. He waited. Ethan didn't bring up the treasurer. Not right away. First, he talked about himself. Not everything, just part of it. He said he had a method for working with lost skills, that lost skills don't disappear, that his servant could collect them, that he could create new techniques from what was collected. The master listened in silence. His expression didn't change. When Ethan finished, the master said one word, "Prove it." Ethan nodded. He asked the master to remove any 3 passive skills from his panel. Any 3, the most useless ones. The master opened his panel. He found 3 weak passives that had been sitting in his inventory ever since he was a bronze player 30 years ago. Plus 1% to perception, plus 0.5% to night vision, plus 1.5% to stamina. Junk. He deleted all three. Ethan watched through the servant as 3 specks of pollen settled on the creature's shoulders. He told the master he'd be back in 7 days. The master nodded. Ethan left. 7 days. He worked every night. 3 components weren't enough for a fully functional device, but they were enough for a demonstration. He added 27 more components from the servant's library to the master's 3, similar in spectrum. Compatible. He fused them into a single thread. Small, but whole. On the 7th day, he came to the master's office. He placed the bundle on the table. The master unwrapped it. He took the thread. Warmth flowed into his palm. His panel flashed. An unknown effect detected. The master froze. He could feel it. Something inside had changed. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out onto the street. It was getting dark. The light was dim, but he could see. Every detail, every shadow, every movement 100 meters away. Night vision, field of view, and stability. His 3 old passive abilities, plus 27 discarded abilities from others, fused into one. The panel didn't know what it was, but it worked. The master sat down. He looked at Ethan for a long time. Then he said that Ethan had just shown him the impossible. Ethan replied that nothing is impossible. There is only the immeasurable. The master was silent for a minute. Then he asked what Ethan wanted. Ethan said, a workshop, a separate room. The status of an independent equipment maintenance master. It was an ancient loophole in the guild's charter. It hadn't been used in 30 years, but it existed. And it provided protection, official protection. The master knew about this loophole. He himself had read the charter from cover to cover when he became a master 20 years ago. He nodded. Then he asked if there was anything else. Ethan took out a notebook. He opened it to the page with the list. He placed it in front of the master. 84 names. The master read them. Slowly. His expression changed. With every line. With every name. He knew some of them. Personally. When he finished reading, his hands clenched into fists on the table. He asked quietly, who? Ethan replied, Han Myung-ho. The master closed his eyes. He opened them. He stood up. He walked over to the wall. He punched it. The wall cracked. He stood facing the wall for a minute. Then he turned around. He sat down. He said that the treasurer had been working at the guild longer than he had, that he had trusted him for 20 years, that he had personally approved every report on those missing, that he had signed off on closing the investigations. His signature. His responsibility. Ethan said that the treasurer hadn't done it out of cruelty. He told him about the cult, about his son, about 20 years of hope. The master listened. His face was stony. When Ethan finished, the master said that understanding the reason didn't absolve him of guilt, but that he was grateful Ethan had come to him and not to City Hall. Ethan nodded. He didn't want to destroy the guild. He wanted to fix it. The master gave him a workshop, a small room in the back of the guild, a separate entrance, a lock, status, a sign. The Quiet Shelf Workshop. Ethan came up with the name himself. The Quiet Shelf. Like a shelf in a warehouse where they put goods that no one is looking for, but that someone needs. The next day, the treasurer came to see the master himself. Ethan didn't know what they discussed behind closed doors. But an hour later, the treasurer emerged from the office. He looked 10 years older. The master followed him out. He called Ethan over. He said that the treasurer had resigned, that he would remain in the guild under supervision, that information about the sect had been passed on to the provincial secret service, that the investigation would proceed quietly, without a scandal, without a public trial, so as not to destroy the guild, which was already on the brink. Ethan nodded. It wasn't ideal, but it was possible. That evening, he sat in his new workshop. A small room, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf, an oil lamp, a window overlooking the courtyard. He laid out his notebooks on the table, 3 of them bulging with notes. He looked at the servant. The servant was standing by the window, gazing out at the courtyard. Ethan said, "We're not just assistants anymore." The servant didn't reply, but Ethan saw his shoulders straighten slightly. The workshop operated quietly. Ethan didn't place any ads. He didn't put up any signs. He didn't solicit customers. The first visitors came on their own. After Hannah defeated her cousin in the fall quarterly tournament. The tournament took place during Ethan's 8th month in the guild. Junior players of the silver and bronze ranks. Hannah advanced through the quarterfinals with ease. The semifinals. Her opponent, Lee Jun-ho, a cousin from the main branch, gold rank, 2 levels above her. Everyone expected her to lose. The commentator announced their names. Hannah stepped into the arena, back straight, eyes fierce, a blade in her right hand. Ethan stood at the edge of the arena, in a master's uniform. Not an apprentice's. The master had given him new clothes, a gray jacket with the insignia of an independent master. But in his right hand, out of habit, was a bucket. Hannah turned to look at him once. He nodded almost imperceptibly. She assumed her stance, her own. Low, wide, heavy. The spectators began to whisper. This wasn't the standard windblade stance. What was she doing? Lee Jun-ho smirked. He said loudly enough for everyone to hear that his cousin was fighting like a longshoreman again. Hannah didn't respond. The gong sounded. Jun-ho attacked first. Quickly, gracefully. Classic gold rank technique. 3 fan-shaped strikes. Hannah dodged the first, the second, the third. Not by evasion, by movement. She simply wasn't standing where the strike was coming from. 2 weeks before the tournament, Ethan had assembled a special passive ability for her. 112 scraps of prediction skills that archers had discarded as unnecessary. The ability to foresee movement half a second in advance. Not magic, calculation. The passive analyzed the opponent's micro-movements and told her body where to go. Individually, each of the 112 skill fragments added a fraction of a percent to her reaction time. Together, they gave her a half-second head start. In combat, half a second is an eternity. Hannah moved differently. Not faster than Jun-ho. Earlier. Each of his strikes landed where she had just been standing. He was hitting air, time and time again. 1 minute, 2, 3. His expression changed. Confidence, irritation, anger, panic. Hannah didn't attack. She waited. Ethan had taught her that. Don't strike until you see an opening. Wait, count. An opening will come. By the 3rd minute, Jun-ho had shifted into full power. He gave it his all. A series of 7 strikes. The last one a spinning kick. Powerful, beautiful, useless. Hannah ducked under it. She found herself inside his guard. And she struck. Once. From the bottom up. A heavy strike from the ground. Through his hip. Through his shoulder. Through the blade. A dockworker's strike. A strike everyone considered crude. A strike that was hers. Jun-ho flew 3 meters away. He fell. He didn't get up. The arena fell silent. Then it erupted. Hannah stood in the center, blade in hand, sweat on her face, eyes wet. Not from tears, from something else. Jun-ho got to his feet, staggering. He demanded an investigation. He said it was impossible, that a silver-ranked fighter couldn't defeat a gold-ranked one, that this was a scam. The commission checked Hannah's panel, a standard set for a silver wind blade. The panel didn't detect the passive ability. It wasn't in the catalog. To the panel, Hannah was an ordinary silver player who had defeated a gold player through sheer skill. The commission found no violations. Jun-ho walked away in a rage. Hannah left the arena. She walked past the crowd, past the congratulations, past the enthusiastic shouts, straight to the master with the bucket. She stopped in front of him and silently bowed, a full bow, a deep one, to the equipment manager. The assistant, the boy with a notebook. A whisper rippled through the hall. Who is that? Why is she bowing to the assistant? What's going on? Ethan stood there, looking at the top of Hannah's head. Then he said quietly, "Stand up. You've this yourself." She straightened up, looked at him, and for the first time ever, she smiled. Not defiantly, not maliciously, warmly, like someone who had finally found their place. From that day on, others began to approach the quiet shelf workshop. First, just one. A young bronze-ranked player of the class no one understood, the mirrorer. His technique reflected attacks, but only partially and only in a certain direction, useless by standard measures. He heard about Hannah, heard that someone had cobbled together a technique for her out of scrap. He came, asked if he could do the same. Ethan looked at his panel, studied the class, asked 3 questions, then said he'd be back in a month. A month later, the reflector received a passive ability that expanded the reflection angle to 120 degrees, crafted from 400 scraps of defensive tech wiped out by tanks. Then came the second one, a healer with a mana defect. Her healing worked, but with a 3-second delay. In battle, 3 seconds means the patient's death. Ethan assembled a compensatory passive ability for her in 6 weeks. The delay was reduced to half a second. Then came the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each arrived with a problem the panel couldn't solve. Each left with something the panel hadn't seen. Ethan didn't take any money. He took skills. Before leaving, each client removed 2 or 3 unnecessary skills right there in the workshop. The servant absorbed them. Payment in kind. Trash in exchange for mastery. By the end of his first year in the guild, the workshop had served 23 people. The servant had 14,000 absorbed pollen units in the library. From these, 23 fully fledged techniques had been compiled for clients, plus 7 for the servant himself, plus prototypes and experiments. The panels still displayed: Ethan Pack, Summoner, 1 star. Manhwa's Servant, base stats. Nothing had changed. For the system. For the world around him, everything had changed. That evening, Ethan gathered the entire circle in the workshop for the first time. Jian brought tea. Sojian came with a spear. Yuna brought a tincture. Hannah arrived with bruises from training. Olivia arrived with a folder from the archives. Dahi came in silently and sat in the corner. The servant stood by the window. 7 people and 1 creature in a small room. Ethan laid a notebook on the table. He opened it to a blank page. He wrote the title, 2-Year Plan. Everyone was looking at him. He began to speak. The second year began with a shock. The empty panel sect discovered that their channel within the guild had been exposed. 2 emissaries arrived at the square in front of the guild at noon. Out in the open, without hiding. Both in black cloaks. Both without a visible rank on the panel. Their lines were empty. No name, no level, no class. The panel didn't see them, just as it hadn't seen Ethan's servant. They hadn't come to talk. They'd come to search. Dahi sensed them a minute before they appeared. She ran into the workshop. She said 1 word: black. Ethan understood. He sent Ji-yoon to fetch Sojian. He sent Hannah to the training hall to keep her out of the way. He sent Olivia to the archives. Yoon to the pharmacy. He kept Dahi by his side. He himself went out to the square. The servant followed him. 2 emissaries were standing by the fountain. One was tall, one was short. Both were looking around. They weren't looking for Ethan. They were looking for an anomaly, a blind spot. Dahi had said they were scanning the lines, looking for a place where the lines broke off, a place the panel couldn't see. Ethan knew that this place was his servant. If the emissaries found the servant, they would find him. He made his decision in 3 seconds. Don't hide. Attack. He sent a mental command to the servant through their link, his first combat command ever. The servant stepped forward, a step like that of water dancers. In a fraction of a second, he was between the 2 emissaries. They didn't have time to react. The servant struck the first one. A nameless blow. To the chest. The emissary flew back toward the fountain wall. He crashed into it. The stone cracked. The second messenger spun around. He extended his arm. A black thread shot out of his palm. A sect technique. The thread flew toward the servant. The servant moved away. 1 step. Another step. He moved in a way no one else in this square had ever moved. Quickly. Precisely. Without any excess. 7 techniques worked simultaneously. Movement. Strike. Shield. Night vision. Quiet breathing. Keen hearing. Stealthy gaze. Everything Ethan had been gathering for months. Everything he had forged from thousands of pieces of someone else's junk. Everything worked. The servant struck the second messenger. 2 blows. Fast. Precise. The messenger fell. Didn't get up. 4 seconds. 2 messengers, both on the ground. The square froze. The players nearby watched, not understanding what had happened. Who had struck them? From where? Ethan stood 20 meters away. The servant had already returned to him. He stood beside him. Quiet. Inconspicuous. A skinny guy in a gray shirt. A minute later, Sojian stepped onto the square. With a spear. His hands didn't tremble. He approached the emissaries. He checked them. Both were unconscious. Sojian looked at Ethan. Ethan shook his head. It wasn't him. Sojian understood. Officially, the envoys had been neutralized by senior instructor Min Sojian. Gold rank. Spearman of the Northern Outpost. Plausible. Logical. No one argued. The envoys were handed over to the province's secret service. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Ethan wasn't present, but Sojian told him the results. The empty panel sect knew there was an anomaly in the province, a blind spot that the panel couldn't track. They didn't know it was a servant. They didn't know it was Ethan. They only knew that somewhere here the system had a hole, And through that hole, someone was collecting what was supposed to disappear. The cult wanted that hole for themselves, not to close it, but to use it. They believed that through the blind spot, they could hack the panel, break the system, and set everyone free. Ethan listened and fought. The cult wants to break the panel. The panel has controlled the world for 20 years. If they break it, what will happen? The gates will remain. The monsters will remain. But the skills, ranks, and the entire defense system will disappear. Chaos. Death. Just like it was in the first year. Only worse. Because now there are hundreds of times more gates. The cult didn't understand this. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Ethan jotted it down in his notebook. The empty panel cult. Threat level, high. Status, active. Response, not right now. After the skirmish, he reinforced the workshop's defenses. He asked Dahi to monitor the guild's perimeter every day. He asked Sojin to organize guard shifts. He asked Jin to monitor unusual changes in skill flows. If the sect sent anyone else, they'd spot them in advance. At the same time, he continued his work. The workshop was growing. Clients were coming in. 5 or 6 new people every month. All of them with problems that the panel couldn't solve. All of them with abilities that the system considered junk. Ethan worked with each one. He studied them. He selected them. He gathered them. The notebooks multiplied. The 4th. The 5th. The 6th. Olivia helped with the research. She found old records in the archives about the panel's early years, documents that no one had read in decades. They contained references to something called the Polygon, a training system, ancient, pre-panel. Olivia showed the records to Ethan. He read all night, and for the first time he began to grasp the scale of it all. The panel wasn't a control system. The panel was a simulator. Someone had created it long ago to prepare people for something, for an external threat, for war, to a catastrophe. The simulator was supposed to run in 10-year cycles and then reset. But 20 years ago, it started up and gotten stuck, and now it was slowly falling apart. The astronomers, whom people still listened to, said that in 10 years, the panel would begin to collapse. Now Ethan understood why. The simulator couldn't run indefinitely. It needed a reset, a reboot. And for that, it needed a collector, someone who would gather all the system's waste, all the pollen, all the erased skills, and at the right moment, return them. Close the cycle. Ethan looked at the servant. The servant was standing by the window, gazing out into the night. Nameless. A single star. The collector's prototype. Built into the starter decks. Waiting for someone who could use it. Ethan was the 4th in 20 years. The first 3 had perished. He'd made it to his 2nd year. He closed his notebook. Looked out the window. The panel pulsed blue. Quieter than before. Or so it seemed to him. The 3rd year. The Silent Regiment's workshop had served 47 people. The servant had absorbed more than 40,000 units of pollen. Inside him was a library that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Thousands of techniques, thousands of skills, thousands of abilities that people had thrown away like trash. Ethan kept records in 9 notebooks. Each was filled to the last page. Columns, rows, matrices. He knew the library's contents by heart, knew every component, every combination, every possibility. The circle had grown. Jen had become the senior receptionist. Her reports were read personally by the guild master. She could see the flow of skills throughout the entire organization in real time and use that information. She predicted crises. She warned of risks. She found anomalies before they became problems. Her registrar class was no longer just bookkeeping. It had become intelligence. Hannah achieved gold rank. The first from a Lee family's junior branch in 3 generations. Cousin Junho stopped calling her a porter. He stopped talking to her altogether. She didn't notice. She trained every evening in the backyard. Her own stance, her own strike, her own school. The school now had a name. Ethan called it Heavy Earth. Hannah accepted the name in silence. Then she wrote it on the blade, in small letters, right by the guard, where no one would see it. Yuna took the healing equipment to her mother. The results came back 2 months later. Not a complete recovery. Stabilization. The drain on her mana had stopped. Her mother had stopped growing weaker. She'd started leaving the house. She'd started smiling. Yuna came to the workshop that evening after receiving a letter from her sister. She stood in the doorway. She looked at Ethan. He was sitting at the table, working on a notebook. She said quietly that her mother had gotten up on her own that morning, without help, for the first time in 2 years. Ethan looked up. He looked at her. She was crying, silently, without a sound, just like Sojin back then. Ethan stood up. He didn't come over. He just stood there and looked at her. She wiped her eyes. She said she understood, and she left, as always. But that evening she came with a tincture not an hour later, but 20 minutes later. And she stayed for 2 hours. They sat in silence. They drank tea. Olivia found the answer to her question about her brother. Ethan helped. 3 years ago, her younger brother had erased all his skills from the panel in a single day. And the next day, he died. Olivia believed the panel had killed him. Ethan checked through a servant. He found her brother's fingerprint in the pollen. Not in the treasurer's white grains. In ordinary pollen. Olivia's brother didn't erase his skills by accident. He erased them because someone forced him to. A technique of subjugation. The very same one. The empty panel sect. Olivia's brother was one of their victims. Not through the treasurer, through another channel, in another city. Olivia found out and didn't leave her room for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she came to the workshop. Her eyes were dry. Her face was calm. She said she wanted to help destroy the cult. Not out of revenge, out of calculation. Ethan nodded. Dathi had learned to speak over the past 3 years. Not much, but enough. She still saw the lines. She still sensed anomalies. But now she could explain what she saw. Ethan taught her. Not words, a system. He gave her his methodology. Tables, classifications. A way to translate visions into data. Dahi kept her own notebook. More detailed than Ethan's. She saw things he couldn't see. And she recorded them in a language he could read. One evening, she placed her notebook in front of him, open to the last page. On the page was a drawing. Not a diagram. A drawing. A panel. A view of the super. Lines extending downward from it to every person. Thousands of lines. And a single dot with no line. A servant. But next to the servant's dot, he had drawn something else. A thin thread extending not downward, but upward. From the servant to the panel. Not a line of control. Something else. Ethan looked at the drawing. He asked what it was. Dahi said, "It's growing." The thread that connects the servant to the panel. It appeared a month ago. It wasn't there before. The servant was completely disconnected from the system. Now he isn't. Now he started to connect. On his own. From the bottom up. It's not the panel pulling him toward it. He's reaching out toward the panel. Ethan looked at the servant. The servant was standing by the window. As always, silent. But Ethan could see. The servant had changed. Over the course of 3 years. He wasn't the skinny guy in the gray shirt anymore. He was different. Not bigger. Not outwardly stronger. But deeper. His eyes weren't empty. There was something in them. Weight. Substance. 40,000 skills that weren't his own. 40,000 shards of other people's lives. He carried them within him. And he was drawn to the panel. Because that was his purpose. He was a collector. A blank canvas. And the blank canvas was beginning to awaken. Ethan closed Dahi's notebook. He looked at her. She was looking at him. Dark eyes. Calm. She knew what was happening. She saw it. And she wasn't afraid. He said quietly, "Thank you for naming it." She didn't understand right away. Then she understood. He wasn't talking about the thread. He was talking about her. About how she first spoken to him 3 years ago through a note. About how he said back then that her class wasn't trash but the most valuable class in the underground. About how he needed her as a witness. He said, "Thank you for naming it." She had named what no one else could name. She gave a name to what she had seen. Dahi was silent. Then she nodded. And for the first time in her life, she spoke a long sentence out loud. She said she was glad that he could see it too. That her whole life she'd been alone with the lines. That her parents thought she was sick. That other children weren't right for her. That she thought she was broken. Until she met the boy with the notebook who saw the world the same way she did. Not with his eyes, with tables. She fell silent. Ethan was silent too. And he stood up. He walked over to the window. He stood next to the servant. He looked up at the sky. The panel was pulsing. Quieter. Fainter. He could see it. Not like Dahi, but he could see it. The light was fading. The cycles were slowing down. The astronomers were right. The panel was beginning to collapse. Not in 10 years, sooner. He returned to the table, opened a blank notebook, the 10th one, wrote a title, The Final Plan, and he began to write. The panel began to collapse in the 4th year. Not all at once, gradually. First, the edges dimmed. Distant provinces on the west coast reported that the gates had stopped closing after a purge. Then, in the capital, the skill shop went offline for 3 hours. Then, players in the southern cities began to lose their... They simply vanished from the panel, without being deleted, without warning. The world didn't panic. Not yet. But Ethan saw the numbers. Jane showed him the reports every morning. The rate of deletions in the guild had dropped by 20% over the last month. Not because players had stopped deleting. It was because the panel had started losing skills on its own. The system was falling apart. Ethan sat in his workshop, staring at his 10th notebook, the final plan. He'd been writing it for half a year, checking it, recalculating, checking it again. The plan was simple. The servant must return everything he collected back to the panel, close the cycle, reload the simulator. 40,000 units of pollen, thousands of techniques, thousands of skills. Everything Ethan had gathered over 4 years. Everything he forged, everything he created. Give it all back. The price was clear. The servant would lose everything. Every technique, every skill, every ability. He would once again become a skinny guy in a gray shirt, without weapons, without stats, a nameless servant of a single star. Ethan had known this ever since the day he read the old records about the polygon. A collector gathers and gives back. He does not keep. He gives back. He didn't tell the servant. Not right away. First, he gathered the circle. Evening. The workshop. The final gathering. Ji poured tea. Sojian stood by the window with a spear. Yuna sat on a chair with a jar of liquor. Hannah sat on the floor with her legs crossed. Olivia held a folder. Dahi sat in the corner with a notebook. The servant stood by the wall. Ethan stood in the center. He told them everything, for the first time. From the beginning, who he was, where he came from, why, about his past life, about the bus, about the voice that said, "I'm sorry," about the 4 years in the boy's body, about the ceremony, about the pollen, about the collector, about the polygon, about how the panel is a simulator, about how it's stuck, about how it's collapsing, and about how the servant can stop it if he gives everything away. The room was silent. He spoke for 20 minutes. When he finished, the silence lasted another minute. Then Hannah spoke up. She asked what would happen to the techniques he'd given them, with her heavy earth, with the predicate, with the passive forms. Ethan replied, "Nothing. The techniques passed on to other people will remain. They're no longer in the servant. They're with those to whom they were given. Only what's inside the servant will disappear." Hannah nodded. Sojian asked what would happen to Ethan. Ethan replied that he didn't know. A summoner without a being is nothing. If the servant loses everything, their connection might not hold. There will be a backlash. What kind? He didn't know. Eunice stood up. She walked over to him, looked him in the eyes. She said quietly that she would be there, no matter what happened. A backlash. Fainting. Worse, she would be there. Ethan looked at her. He nodded. Olivia asked when. Ethan replied, "Tomorrow. The panel is dimming every day. If we wait any longer, it might be too late." Dahi raised her head. She looked at the servant, then at Ethan. She said that the thread connecting the servant to the parent had grown thick, like a rope. The servant is ready. He knows what to do. He's waiting. Ethan looked at the servant. The servant looked back at him. For the first time in 4 years, Ethan saw something other than emptiness in his eyes. Not heaviness, not weight, understanding. The servant knew. Perhaps he had known from the very beginning. He was a collector's prototype. He was created for this, to gather and to give. Ethan walked over to him, stood face to face, looked him in the eyes, said quietly, "You knew." The servant didn't answer, but Ethan sensed it through their bond. Yes, he knew. From the very first day, from the very first speck of pollen. He knew why he ate, knew why he grew, knew that one day he would give everything away. And he wasn't afraid. Ethan clenched his teeth, turned away, walked over to the table. He picked up a cup of tea, took a sip, set it down. His hands were shaking. Not from the after effects. They'd spent the night in the workshop. No one had left. John brewed tea every hour. Sojin sat by the window, sharpening the tip of a spear. Hannah lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling. Yuma sat next to Ethan and silently held his wrist. She was checking his pulse. A habit. Olivia read aloud from an old Western poem. No one understood the language. Everyone listened. Dahi kept track of the tally. A servant stood by the window, gazing out into the night. Ethan sat on the floor, cup in hand, and said nothing. Outside the window, the first snow was falling. Dawn. Ethan stood up. Everyone stood up. He left the workshop, walked down the hallway, left the guild. Through the backyard, out onto the square. The morning was cold. A thin layer of snow lay on the stones. The square was empty. Early morning. No one around. Just him, and the servant, and the six behind him. Ethan stopped in the center of the square. He looked up. The panel hung in the sky. Dull. The pulsation had slowed. Cracks were spreading across the glass grid. Small, but visible. He looked at the servant. The servant stood beside him. Calm. Ready. Ethan held out his hand. The servant took it, palm to palm. Just like that first time when Ethan had tried to transfer the technique, only in the opposite direction. Ethan closed his eyes. He focused on the connection. He stepped inside. A dark room. Huge. Not small like at the beginning. Huge. Full of light. 40,000 specs. Thousands of threads. Thousands of techniques. 4 years of work. Each spec was someone's discarded skill. Someone's forgotten ability. Someone's erased skill. Ethan looked at it and didn't see pollen. He saw people. Thousands of people who had once possessed these skills. Thousands of hands. Thousands of strokes. Thousands of steps. Thousands of sighs. All of it was here, in a single being. In a single skinny guy in a gray shirt who had stood silently by the window for 4 years, waiting. Ethan said over the comlink, "It's time." The servant nodded, for the first time. For the first time in 4 years, he made a conscious movement. He nodded, and began. A thread from the servant to the panel. Daki saw it. She stood 10 meters away and watched. A rope of light ran upward from the servant, toward the grate, toward the panel, and pollen began to rise along that rope. All of it, at once. 40,000 units, thousands of technicians, everything. The stream flowed upward, like a river turned toward the sky. Light, warm, golden, green, blue, red. All the colors of all skills, all the shades of all abilities. The stream was visible to everyone. Not just the Dahi, not just Ethan, everyone. People came out of their homes and looked up. Players stopped in the streets. Children pointed. A pillar of light stretched from the square toward the sky, and the panel was receiving it. The cracks began to close. The pulsation quickened. The light grew brighter. The grid in the sky, which had been fading for months, flared up, brightly. Just like on that first day 20 years ago. Ethan stood with his eyes closed, holding the servant's hand. He could feel everything leaving the servant. Every technique, every skill. The water dancer's step, the nameless strike, the passive shield, night vision, quiet breathing, keen hearing, the quiet eye. Everything was slipping away. Everything was returning to where it came from. To the system, to the proving ground, to the cycle. The backlash struck halfway through the process. Pain, not a headache. His whole body, as if his bones were being pulled out. Ethan staggered. Yuna was beside him. She was holding his shoulder, the tincture in her other hand. He pushed her hand away. Not now. He couldn't let go now. If he let go of the servant's hand, the flow would be interrupted. The cycle wouldn't close. He held on. He clenched his teeth. The pain intensified. Cyan stood on the other side. He placed a hand on Ethan's back. Not for support, for stability, so Ethan wouldn't fall. Hannah stood in front of them, facing the square, a blade in her hand. If anyone tried to approach and interfere, they'd have to get past her. Olivia stood next to Dahi, holding her hand. Dahi looked up. Her eyes were wide. She saw what no one else could see. Lines. Thousands of lines. They were rearranging themselves, intertwining, changing. The system was rebooting. The cycle was closing. The flow lasted 3 minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the servant. The servant stood before him. A skinny guy in a gray shirt, unarmed, without any special traits. His eyes were empty, just like on the first day. Everything was gone. Everything Ethan had gathered over 4 years. Every grain, every thread, every technique. The servant was empty again. Ethan let go of his hand. His knees buckled. He fell. Yuna caught him. She sat him down on the rocks. She poured him some tincture. The world swam. It grew dark. It returned. Ethan sat on the snow-wet rocks and looked up. The panel glowed. Brightly. Steadily. There were no cracks. The pulsation was strong and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The panel flashed, a single line, visible to everyone, all over the world. One line in every language at once. Cycle complete. System stabilized. Next cycle in 10 years. The people in the square read it and didn't understand. But Ethan understood. The test site had rebooted. The simulator had received its waste back. The cycle had closed. The system would operate for another 10 years. And then a new collector would be needed. Or the same one. Ethan looked at the servant. The servant stood nearby. Empty. Silent. But alive. He hadn't disembodied. He hadn't vanished. He remained. A single star. Nameless. Basic specifications. But alive. Ethan smiled. All right, so let's start over. Then he heard a voice, not from outside, from within. Quiet. Familiar. That very one. From the white light. From the second before the bus. The voice said 2 words. Thank you. And I'm sorry. Ethan sat on the rocks. Snow fell on his face. He closed his eyes and replied in his mind. What for? The voice answered. For pulling you out. Into a job you didn't choose. Ethan thought. For a long time. Then he replied. I didn't choose it, but I don't regret it. The voice fell silent. Whether it was forever or not, Ethan didn't know. But it was enough for him. He opened his eyes. Yuna was sitting next to him. She was holding his wrist, checking his pulse. Sojian stood over him, a spear in his hand. His hands weren't shaking. Hannah sheathed her blade. She turned to him. Her eyes were wet. She was laughing. She was swearing in 3 dialects out of relief. Olivia stood slightly to the side. The folder was pressed against her chest. Her eyes were red. She was smiling. Dahi was crouching next to him. She was looking at him and smiling. Quietly. As quietly as she could. Jiyeon stood behind everyone. She was holding a tray. On the tray was a teapot and 7 cups. She had poured more tea when the light had just begun. She knew it would be needed later. Ethan looked at them. At all of them. At each one. 6 people and 1 creature. Each of them had once been alone. Each had been written off. Each was trashed by the system's standards. The registrar, the observer, the herbalist, the veteran with trembling hands, the half-breed from the Western Consortium, the girl who hits like a longshoreman, and the boy with the notebook who, in a past life, optimized tomato shipments. They all found each other through the trash, through discarded skills, through written-off classes, through reports that no one read, through notebooks that no one kept. Ethan took the cup from Jean's hands. It was hot. Herbal tea, Yoon's recipe. He took a sip. He looked at the servant. The servant stood nearby, empty, clean, ready to start over. Ethan set the cup down on the stones. He took a notebook out of his pocket, the 10th one. He opened it to a blank page. He wrote, Project Nameless, Phase 1, again. And below that, Day 1. He raised his head. He looked at the circle. Everyone was looking at him. He said, tomorrow will be a tough day, as always. And that he was glad he wasn't alone. Snow was falling on the square. The panel glowed in the sky with an even blue light. The tea was growing cold on the stones. Ethan sat among his people and looked at the blank page. 10 years lay ahead, and he knew what to do with each and every one of them.